Close your eyes, breathe slowly. Tonight we travel to the oldest question that human beings have ever asked. Not what is out there beyond the horizon, not what lies beneath the surface of the earth or above the ceiling of the sky, but the question that precedes all other questions, the one that has no object outside the asker, the one that arises in the specific silence between one heartbeat and the next. Why is there something rather than nothing, and what does that something ask of me? The history of religion is the history of that question, asked in 10,000 languages, answered in 10,000 ways, written in stone and blood and song and silence across every continent and every century that human beings have inhabited the earth. Tonight we will travel through 100 facts about that history, not to judge, not to convert, not to argue, but to understand. To sit with the full weight of what human beings have believed, feared, loved, and built in the name of the sacred. Let the darkness hold you, let the quiet carry you, we begin. Fact 1. The first religion, before the gods had names. The specific origin of religion, the particular moment or process by which the specific cognitive and behavioral patterns that constitute what human beings mean when they use the word religion, first emerged in the specific populations of anatomically modern humans whose particular evolutionary history had equipped them, by approximately 300,000 years ago, with the specific brain architecture whose combination of symbolic thought, theory of mind, and awareness of mortality creates the specific conditions from which religious experience appears to arise, is not a question that archaeology can answer with certainty, because the specific internal states of prehistoric human beings leave no direct trace in the specific physical record that survives for excavation. What the specific archaeological record does preserve, however, is the specific material evidence of behaviors whose particular character, the specific intentional burial of the dead with grave goods, the specific creation of non-utilitarian symbolic objects, the specific painting of cave walls with images whose arrangement and repetition suggests something beyond mere decoration, implies the presence of the specific cognitive dispositions that underlie religious thought. The specific capacity for symbolic representation, the specific awareness of death as a universal condition requiring explanation, and the specific impulse to mark the specific boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary with deliberate, repeated communal ritual. The specific oldest known intentional burials, at sites including Kafse Cave in Israel, where anatomically modern humans buried their dead with red ochre and pierced shells approximately 90,000 years ago, and Eskul Cave nearby, where similar practices appear at roughly the same period, suggest that the specific impulse to treat the dead as something other than biological refuse. The specific impulse to accompany them with objects and substances whose particular symbolic significance we can no longer fully recover had already emerged before the specific migration of modern humans out of Africa that would carry their specific descendants to every continent on Earth. Religion, in this sense, is not an invention. It is not a technology that one person created and others adopted. It is the specific name that human beings give to a set of responses to the specific conditions of conscious existence. Mortality, mystery, community, and the specific awareness of a world that exceeds the capacity of any individual mind to comprehend or control. Responses that appear in some form wherever conscious beings with the specific cognitive architecture of Homo sapiens have lived long enough to think. Fact 2. The Neolithic Revolution and the First Temples, Göbekli Tepe. The specific discovery of Göbekli Tepe, the particular archaeological site in southeastern Turkey, whose excavation, begun in 1994 by the German archaeologist Klaus Schmidt, and continuing today under the auspices of the German Archaeological Institute, has revealed the specific remains of a monumental ritual complex constructed by hunter-gatherer communities approximately 11,600 years ago, making it the oldest known large-scale stone architecture on the surface of the Earth by a margin of several thousand years, transformed the specific understanding of the relationship between religion, social complexity, and the specific economic transition from foraging to agriculture that constitutes what archaeologists call the Neolithic Revolution, overturning the specific assumption that had dominated prehistory for generations. That monumental architecture requires agriculture, that surplus food production is the specific prerequisite for the specific social organization capable of building in stone at scale. Göbekli Tepe demonstrates the specific opposite, that the specific communal labor of construction, organized by the specific social bonds of shared ritual, may itself have been one of the specific drivers of the Neolithic Revolution, the particular demands of feeding and coordinating the specific large groups of workers required to quarry, transport, and erect the specific T-shaped limestone pillars, some of them weighing more than 10 tons. Their specific surfaces carved with the specific bas-relief images of foxes, boars, cranes, vultures, scorpions, and abstract symbols, whose particular meaning remains undeciphered. possibly creating the specific incentive to cultivate grain and domesticate animals that would transform the specific human relationship to the land. The specific site consists of at least 20 circular enclosures, each defined by a specific ring of T-pillars whose particular arrangement around two larger central pillars creates a specific spatial organization whose character, the specific orientation of the central pillars, the specific placement of the carved animals, the specific evidence of feasting deposits in the surrounding sediment, suggests a specific complex of communal ritual activity whose particular nature, whether initiatory, funerary, cosmological, or some specific combination of all three, remains the subject of active scholarly debate. What Göbekli Tepe tells us, with a specificity that no amount of scholarly caution can diminish, is that human beings built temples before they built cities, that the specific impulse to create a dedicated space for communal encounter with the sacred preceded, and may have produced, the specific economic and social transformations that we call civilization. Fact 3. The gods of Mesopotamia, the first named deities. The specific religious system of ancient Mesopotamia, the particular complex of beliefs, practices, myths, rituals, and institutional structures that developed in the river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates, from the specific emergence of the Sumerian city-states in approximately the 4th millennium BCE through the specific successive civilizations of Akkad, Babylon, and Assyria, persisting in recognizable form until the specific conquest of Mesopotamia by Alexander of Macedon in 331 BCE, constitutes the oldest extensively documented religion on Earth, its particular gods and their stories preserved in the specific cuneiform tablets, whose decipherment since the 19th century has given historians direct access to the specific theological imagination of human beings who lived more than 4,000 years ago. The specific pantheon of Mesopotamian religion was vast and hierarchically organized, a specific cosmic bureaucracy whose particular structure mirrored the specific administrative structures of the Mesopotamian city-states themselves, with the specific great gods presiding over the specific domains of sky, air, earth, and water, and the specific lesser gods responsible for the specific particular aspects of human life, agriculture, craft, and warfare. Among the most significant of these deities were Anu, the specific god of the sky and the specific nominal head of the divine assembly, Enlil, the specific god of wind and air whose particular authority over the specific fate of humanity made him arguably the most powerful of the active gods, Enki, the specific god of wisdom, fresh water, and craftsmanship whose particular character, clever, sometimes mischievous, generally sympathetic to humanity, made him one of the most beloved figures in the specific Mesopotamian mythological imagination, and Inanna, the specific goddess of love, war, and the specific planet Venus whose particular mythology, including the specific descent of Inanna, in which the goddess travels to the underworld and returns transformed, constitutes one of the most psychologically rich and most widely interpreted narratives in the entire corpus of ancient religion. The specific Mesopotamian conception of the relationship between gods and human beings was frank and unsentimental. Human beings had been created, according to the specific Atrahasis epic, specifically to relieve the gods of the specific burden of labor, to till the fields and build the temples and bring the offerings that the specific gods required. This was not degradation. It was the specific cosmic role that gave human life its particular meaning and dignity. Fact 4. The Epic of Gilgamesh, religion's first great story. The specific Epic of Gilgamesh, the particular narrative poem whose various Mesopotamian versions, the oldest of which date to approximately 2100 BCE, and whose most complete surviving form is the specific standard Babylonian version, assembled by the scholar priest Sinlaikun Nini in approximately the 12th century BCE, and preserved in the specific library of the Assyrian king Ashurbanipal at Nineveh, constitutes the oldest known long-form literary narrative in the history of human civilization, is not, in the specific narrow sense of the term, a religious text. It contains no specific liturgy, no specific ritual instructions, no specific theology in the systematic sense. But it is, in the specific deeper sense, the oldest surviving expression of the specific religious questions that have animated human thought in every culture that has grappled with them. The specific question of what it means to be mortal, the specific question of whether friendship can survive the specific asymmetry of death, the specific question of whether the specific gods are just, and the specific question of what, if anything, remains of a human life after the specific body that housed it has returned to the earth. The specific narrative follows Gilgamesh, the specific king of Uruk, 2/3 divine, 1/3 human, according to the specific text's own introduction, through the specific stages of a journey that begins in the specific arrogance of unchecked power, passes through the specific transforming experience of friendship with the wild man Enkidu, and arrives through the specific catastrophe of Enkidu's death. At the specific confrontation with mortality that sends Gilgamesh on his specific quest for immortality across the specific waters of death to find Utnapishtim, the specific man to whom the gods granted eternal life after the specific great flood. Specific answer Gilgamesh receives, that immortality is not available to human beings, that the specific gods kept it for themselves when they created mortality, and that the specific best a human being can do is to eat, drink, love, and build well in the specific days allotted to them, is not consolation but recognition, the specific oldest written response to the specific oldest human question, and still in its specific honesty, one of the most compelling answers ever given. Fact 5. Ancient Egypt and the religion of eternal life. The specific religious system of ancient Egypt, the particular complex of beliefs, myths, rituals, and institutional structures that developed along the Nile from the specific unification of Upper and Lower Egypt under the first pharaoh in approximately 3100 BCE and persisted, with continuous evolution but recognizable continuity, until the specific closure of the last Egyptian temple by the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius in 391 CE, a span of more than 3,500 years that makes it the longest continuously practiced state religion in the specific history of human civilization, was organized around a small number of specific central preoccupations whose particular intensity and particular elaboration distinguishes Egyptian religion from all other ancient religious systems. The specific preoccupation with death and what follows it, the specific preoccupation with the daily renewal of cosmic order against the specific constant threat of chaos, and the specific preoccupation with the particular person of the pharaoh as the specific mediating figure between the specific divine and human orders, whose particular ritual performance maintained the specific balance on which all life depended. The specific Egyptian conception of the afterlife, whose particular elaboration, from the specific pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom through the specific coffin texts of the Middle Kingdom and the specific Book of the Dead of the New Kingdom, constitutes one of the most extensive and most carefully articulated visions of post-mortem existence in the entire history of religion, was not a vague hope but a specific technical project. The specific preservation of the body through mummification, the specific provision of the deceased with the specific goods, and the specific magical texts required to navigate the specific dangers of the underworld, the specific performance of the specific opening of the mouth ritual that restored to the mummified body the specific capacity for sensation and action, and the specific judgment of the soul in the specific hall of two truths, where the specific heart of the deceased was weighed against the specific feather of Maat, the particular goddess of truth, justice, and cosmic order, whose particular outcome determined whether the specific individual would enjoy the specific eternal life of the justified, or be devoured by the specific composite monster Ammit, and cease to exist entirely. Egyptian religion is, in this specific sense, the first great human experiment in the specific idea that moral conduct and cosmic survival are connected, that how a person lives determines what, if anything, comes after. Fact 6. The Vedas, the oldest living religious tradition. The specific religious tradition whose origins are encoded in the Vedas, the particular collection of Sanskrit hymns, ritual formulas, philosophical speculations, and liturgical instructions whose oldest layer, the Rigveda, was composed in the specific northwestern region of the Indian subcontinent by the specific Indo-Aryan communities whose particular migration into the region is dated by most scholars to approximately 1500 BCE, and whose specific tradition of oral transmission, memorized and recited by the specific hereditary class of Brahmin priests, whose particular training in the specific techniques of exact memorization preserved the specific texts with a fidelity that modern scholars have verified is extraordinary, has continued without interruption from that specific period to the present day, making it the oldest continuously practiced religious tradition whose specific original texts survive in their original language, is the specific ancestor of what the world today calls Hinduism, though the specific relationship between the Vedic religion of the 2nd millennium BCE and the specific vastly diverse complex of beliefs, practices, sects, philosophies, and devotional traditions that constitutes contemporary Hinduism is one of continuous transformation rather than specific direct identity. The specific gods of the Rigveda, Indra, the specific warrior god of thunder, and the specific slayer of the cosmic serpent Vritra, whose particular hymns form the largest single body of Rigvedic poetry. Agni, the specific god of fire and the specific mediator between humans and gods, whose particular presence in every sacrificial flame made him the specific most immediately present of the Vedic deities. Varuna, the specific god of cosmic order and moral law whose particular omniscience and particular concern with human conduct anticipates the specific ethical monotheism of later religious traditions. And Soma, the specific god and the specific ritual drink whose particular effects on consciousness gave the specific Vedic ritual its specific altered quality, are not the gods of contemporary Hinduism, though some of them persist in transformed forms. What persists unchanged is the specific idea at the heart of the Vedic tradition, that the specific performance of ritual with the specific correct words, the specific correct actions, and the specific correct intention maintains the specific cosmic order on which all life depends. That religion is not merely a private relationship between an individual and the divine, but a specific cosmic responsibility whose fulfillment or neglect has consequences for the entire world. Fact 7. The Hebrew Bible and the invention of monotheism. The specific emergence of monotheism, the particular religious idea that there exists only one God, that this God is the creator of all things, that this God is not limited to any specific territory or any specific people, but is the universal sovereign of all existence. And that the specific relationship between this God and human beings is governed by a specific covenant, whose particular terms define both the specific obligations of the human party and the specific commitments of the divine, in the specific context of ancient Israelite religion constitutes one of the most consequential specific intellectual developments in the entire history of human thought, its particular influence extending through the specific traditions of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam to shape the specific religious experience of more than half the human beings alive on Earth today. The specific path from the polytheism of the ancient Near East to the specific strict monotheism of Second Temple Judaism was neither sudden nor straightforward. The specific Hebrew Bible itself preserves, in its specific oldest layers, abundant evidence of the specific earlier religious landscape from which Israelite monotheism emerged. The specific references to other gods as real beings whose particular worship was forbidden rather than whose particular existence was denied. The specific survival of the divine council imagery in which the God of Israel presides over a specific assembly of divine beings, and the specific proper names and specific epithets whose particular etymology reveals the specific polytheistic background from which the specific Israelite religious tradition developed. The specific figure of the prophet, the particular individual called by God to speak the specific divine word to the specific community, to challenge the specific king, to warn the specific people, to insist on the specific connection between the specific worship of the one God and the specific treatment of the poor and the vulnerable, is the specific invention of the Israelite religious tradition that has had the most transformative specific influence on the subsequent history of religion. The specific idea that the specific divine will is not expressed primarily through the specific performance of ritual, but through the specific demand for justice, that the specific God of Israel cares not merely for the specific correct conduct of worship, but for the specific condition of the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. Fact 8. The Buddha and the Middle Way, the birth of Buddhism. The specific life of Siddhartha Gautama, the particular historical figure whose particular biography, the specific details of which are partly obscured by the specific legendary elaborations that began to accumulate around his memory within generations of his death, places his birth in the specific foothills of the Himalayas, in what is now southern Nepal in approximately 563 BCE. His specific renunciation of the specific privileged life of a warrior clan aristocrat in his late 20s, his specific years of ascetic practice under the specific teachers of the day, his specific rejection of the specific extreme asceticism that was the dominant contemplative methodology of his time and place, and his specific attainment of what the specific Buddhist tradition calls enlightenment, bodhi, the specific awakening to the specific nature of reality. Under a specific pipal tree at Bodh Gaya in what is now the state of Bihar in northeastern India, in approximately 528 BCE, is the specific foundation of the specific religious tradition that today numbers approximately 500 million adherents across the specific countries of Asia, and increasingly throughout the specific Western world. The specific content of the Buddha's enlightenment, the specific Four Noble Truths whose particular formulation constitutes the specific first teaching delivered after the specific awakening, and whose specific content is that suffering is the specific universal condition of unawakened existence, that the specific cause of suffering is craving and aversion, that the specific cessation of suffering is possible, and that the specific Eightfold Path is the specific method of that cessation, is remarkable not for its specific theological content, which makes no specific claims about the specific existence or non-existence of a creator God, but for its specific methodological character. It is, in a specific sense, an empirical claim, a specific assertion that the specific nature of human suffering and the specific method of its relief can be investigated through the specific practice of meditation, the specific cultivation of ethics, and the specific development of wisdom, and that the specific results of this investigation are in principle available to any human being willing to undertake it. The specific Buddha is not a god. The specific Buddhist tradition is careful on this point, but a specific human being who discovered something about the specific nature of mind that the specific rest of humanity had not yet discovered, and who spent the specific remaining 45 years of his life teaching what he had found. Fact 9. Ancient Greece and the religion of the Olympians. The specific religious system of ancient Greece, the particular complex of myths, rituals, festivals, oracles, mystery cults, and philosophical theologies whose particular character, the specific product of the specific Greek cultural environment in which the specific absence of a priestly caste with the specific authority to define orthodoxy created a specific religious landscape of unusual diversity and unusual intellectual openness, distinguishes it from virtually every other major ancient religious tradition, was organized around the specific pantheon of 12 Olympian deities whose particular stories, told and retold in the specific corpus of Greek epic, lyric, dramatic, and philosophical literature from Homer to Plato, constitute the specific most widely known mythological tradition in the history of the Western world, their specific names: Zeus, Hera, Poseidon, Demeter, Athene, Apollo, Artemis, Ares, Aphrodite, Hephaestus, Hermes, and Dionysus, still carried in the specific vocabulary of a dozen languages. The specific Greek gods were not the omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect beings of later monotheistic theology. They were, in the specific most revealing sense, human beings writ large, subject to the specific passions of desire, jealousy, pride, and anger, capable of the specific pettiness and the specific generosity of human beings, limited by the specific fate that even the specific gods could not entirely circumvent, and related to human beings not through the specific abstract bond of creation, but through the specific concrete bonds of genealogy, the specific divine parentage of specific heroes, and the specific erotic encounters that produce the specific demigods whose particular stories constitute much of the specific substance of Greek myth. The specific Greek religious innovation that has had the most enduring influence on subsequent Western thought is not in the specific mythology, but in the specific philosophical critique of mythology, the particular tradition, beginning with Xenophanes of Colophon in the 6th century BCE and developing through Plato and the Stoics, of using the specific tools of rational argument to examine, criticize, and ultimately transform the specific inherited religious tradition, creating the specific first, sustained intellectual engagement between reason and revelation that would define the subsequent history of Western religious thought. Fact 10. Religion at 10. 10 facts into the history of religion, and already the specific shape of the story begins to emerge, not the specific shape of a single narrative moving in a single direction, but the specific shape of a vast conversation conducted across millennia and continents, in languages that can no longer be spoken, and in languages that are spoken by billions of people today, about the specific questions that no human civilization has ever found a way to stop asking. We have begun in the specific darkness before recorded history, where the specific archaeological traces of burial and ritual suggest that the specific impulse to mark the boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary, between the living and the dead, between the known and the unknown, is as old as the specific modern human mind itself. We have stood at Göbekli Tepe and understood that the specific first great human building projects were not granaries or palaces but temples, that the specific need to gather in the presence of the sacred preceded, and may have driven, the specific transformation of human economic life that we call civilization. We have heard the specific names of the first gods, the Mesopotamian deities whose specific stories of creation, flood, and the search for immortality echo in traditions that billions of people hold sacred today. We have sat with the specific oldest written story in the world, and found that it is, at its specific core, a story about what it means to lose someone you love and to discover, in that specific loss, the specific reality of your own mortality. We have followed the specific religious traditions of Egypt, of the Vedic world, of ancient Israel, of the India of the Buddha, and of classical Greece, each of them a specific response, shaped by a specific landscape and a specific history, to the specific same conditions of conscious existence. 90 facts remain. Ahead of us lie the specific births of Christianity and Islam, the specific spread of religion across continents and oceans, the specific wars fought in the name of the sacred and the specific peace made in the same name, the specific encounter between religion and science, and the specific question of what religion is becoming in the specific world that we inhabit now. Rest in the specific darkness. The story is only beginning. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 11. The birth of Christianity, the life and death of Jesus of Nazareth. The specific historical figure of Jesus of Nazareth, the particular Jewish preacher and healer whose life, teachings, crucifixion, and the specific claims made about his resurrection by the specific community of followers who gathered in the aftermath of his death, constitute the specific foundation of the religious tradition that today numbers approximately 2.4 billion adherents, making Christianity the single largest religion in the specific history of human civilization. Was born in the specific context of 1st century Judea, a specific Roman province whose particular political and religious landscape, the specific product of centuries of foreign domination, punctuated by the specific Maccabean revolt that had briefly restored Jewish independence in the 2nd century BCE, and followed by the specific Roman conquest of 63 BCE, had generated the specific atmosphere of intense messianic expectation in which his specific ministry would unfold and to which his specific message would speak. The specific details of Jesus' life, his specific birth in Galilee, his specific baptism by John the Baptist in the Jordan River, his specific gathering of disciples, his specific itinerant ministry of preaching and healing in the specific villages and towns of Galilee and Judea, his specific entry into Jerusalem in the final week of his life, his specific arrest, trial, and crucifixion by the specific Roman authorities under the specific prefect Pontius Pilate, are attested with varying degrees of specificity and reliability in the specific 4 canonical Gospels, whose particular accounts, written between approximately 70 and 100 CE, constitute the specific primary sources for his biography, supplemented by the specific brief references in the works of the Roman historians Tacitus and Suetonius, and the specific mention by the Jewish historian Josephus. What distinguishes the specific teaching of Jesus from the specific teaching of the many other Jewish preachers and wisdom teachers of his era is the specific combination of an intensely personal ethical demand. Love your enemies, forgive without limit, serve the poor and the outcast, treat others as you wish to be treated, with the specific proclamation of the imminent arrival of what he called the kingdom of God, a specific transformation of the world whose particular character, whether political, cosmic, or interior, has been the subject of the specific most sustained and most consequential theological debate in the entire history of Western religion. It is the specific claim made after his death that he had risen from the dead, that his resurrection validated his specific identity as the Messiah promised by the specific Hebrew prophets, and that through his specific death, the specific relationship between God and humanity had been fundamentally and permanently transformed, that created Christianity as a specific religion, distinct from the specific Judaism in which it had been born. Fact 12. Zoroastrianism, the religion that invented good and evil. The specific religious tradition founded by the prophet Zarathustra, known in the Western tradition by the specific Greek form of his name, Zoroaster, and dated by different scholars to periods ranging from 1500 BCE to 600 BCE. The specific uncertainty of this dating, reflecting the specific difficulty of distinguishing the historical prophet from the specific legendary elaborations that accumulated around his memory, is the specific oldest of the great prophetic religions, the particular tradition in which the specific idea of a single supreme deity, engaged in a cosmic struggle against a specific principle of evil first, received its systematic theological formulation, making Zoroastrianism the specific religious tradition whose particular influence on the subsequent development of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam is both enormous and frequently underappreciated. The specific theology of Zoroastrianism is built around the specific opposition between Ahura Mazda, the specific wise Lord, the specific supreme deity of truth, light, and goodness, and Angra Mainyu, the specific destructive spirit whose particular character as the specific source of all evil, darkness, and falsehood constitutes the first fully developed theological concept of the devil in the specific history of religion. The specific universe of Zoroastrian theology is a specific battleground in which the specific forces of truth and falsehood, light and darkness, life and death are engaged in a specific cosmic conflict whose particular outcome, the specific final renovation of the world, the specific resurrection of the dead, the specific universal judgment, and the specific ultimate triumph of Ahura Mazda, will bring the specific drama of existence to its specific conclusion. The specific elements of this theology, cosmic dualism, the specific personification of evil, the specific resurrection of the dead, the specific final judgment, and the specific eschatological renewal of the world, appear with remarkable specificity in the specific later developments of Jewish apocalyptic literature, particularly in the specific period following the specific Persian conquest of Babylon in 539 BCE, when the specific Jewish community in exile came into sustained contact with the specific Zoroastrian religious culture of the Persian Empire whose specific kings, including Cyrus the Great and Darius I, were themselves Zoroastrian. The specific fire temples of Zoroastrianism, in which the specific sacred flame, tended continuously by the specific hereditary priests, serves as the specific visible symbol of the divine light of Ahura Mazda, continue to burn today in the specific communities of the Parsis of India and the specific Zoroastrians of Iran, the specific living remnant of what was once the state religion of 3 successive Persian empires. Fact 13. The birth of Islam, the Prophet Muhammad, and the Quran. The specific emergence of Islam, the particular religious tradition whose specific founding, is located in the specific career of the Prophet Muhammad, born in Mecca in approximately 570 CE into the specific tribe of Quraysh, who received the specific first of the revelations that would constitute the Quran in approximately 610 CE, and who, at his specific death in 632 CE, had unified the specific tribes of the Arabian Peninsula under the specific banner of the new faith, whose particular name, Islam, meaning submission, or surrender to the will of God, defines the specific relationship between the believer and the divine that constitutes its specific theological core, represents the specific last of the 3 great Abrahamic religions to emerge, and the specific one whose particular geographic and demographic expansion in the century following the specific prophet's death was the most rapid in the specific history of religion. The specific Muslim community, growing from the specific small persecuted group that had accompanied Muhammad on his specific hijrah, the particular migration from Mecca to Medina in 622 CE that marks the specific beginning of the Islamic calendar, to the specific rulers of an empire stretching from the specific Iberian Peninsula in the west to the specific borders of China in the east within a single century. The specific theology of Islam is built on 5 specific pillars. The specific Shahada, or declaration of faith, whose particular formulation, there is no God but God, and Muhammad is the messenger of God, is the specific most concise expression of Islamic monotheism. The specific Salat, or 5 daily prayers, whose particular performance at the specific prescribed times structures the specific daily life of the believer around the specific rhythm of divine remembrance. The specific Zakat, or obligatory almsgiving, whose particular rate and particular recipients are specified in the specific Islamic legal tradition. The specific Sawm, or fasting during the specific month of Ramadan, and the specific Hajj, or pilgrimage to Mecca, required of every Muslim who is physically and financially able to undertake it at least once in their lifetime, and on the specific Quran, whose particular status in Islamic theology as the specific literal word of God, dictated to the specific prophet by the specific angel Jibril, and preserved without alteration from the specific moment of its revelation, distinguishes it from the specific scriptures of Judaism and Christianity in a way whose particular consequences for the specific Islamic approach to textual interpretation, legal reasoning, and the specific relationship between revelation and reason have shaped 14 centuries of Islamic intellectual history. Fact 14. The spread of Buddhism, the Dharma crosses Asia. The specific spread of Buddhism from its specific place of origin in northeastern India, across the specific vast geographic and cultural territories of Asia, a specific process that unfolded over approximately 15 centuries, from the specific missionary activity sponsored by the Mauryan Emperor Ashoka in the 3rd century BCE, who sent specific Buddhist missionaries to Sri Lanka, Central Asia, and the specific Hellenistic kingdoms of the Near East. Through the specific transmission of the Dharma along the specific trade routes of the Silk Road to the specific oasis cities of Central Asia, and from there to the specific kingdoms of China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam, and through the specific maritime routes that carried Theravada Buddhism to the specific kingdoms of Southeast Asia, is the specific first great example in the history of religion of a specific tradition successfully crossing the specific boundaries of language, culture, and civilization without the specific military or political coercion that would later characterize the spread of Christianity and Islam in many of their specific contexts. The specific reason for Buddhism's particular success as a missionary religion is bound up with the specific character of the Buddha's teaching itself. The specific 4 Noble Truths and the specific Eightfold Path make no specific claims about the specific identity of a chosen people, require no specific allegiance to a specific national history, and propose no specific theology of creation that would conflict with the specific cosmological systems of the specific cultures into which Buddhism moved. What Buddhism offered to the specific cultures it encountered was a specific practical methodology, a specific set of practices, including meditation, ethical conduct, and the specific cultivation of wisdom, whose particular benefits could be verified in the specific experience of the practitioner. and whose specific adaptability to the specific local cultural and philosophical traditions of the specific receiving cultures produced the specific extraordinary diversity of Buddhist traditions that exists today. The specific Theravada Buddhism of Sri Lanka and mainland Southeast Asia, the specific Mahayana Buddhism of China, Korea, and Japan in its specific dozens of schools and sects, and the specific Vajrayana Buddhism of Tibet and the Himalayan region, each of them the specific product of the particular encounter between the specific original Indian Buddhist tradition and the specific local religious and cultural environment into which it moved. Fact 15. The Council of Nicaea, Christianity defines itself. The specific Council of Nicaea, the particular gathering of Christian bishops convened by the Roman Emperor Constantine, at the specific city of Nicaea, in what is now northwestern Turkey, in 325 CE, the first of the specific ecumenical councils of the Christian Church, whose particular decisions were understood by the specific participants to be binding on the entire specific Christian community, was called to resolve the specific theological controversy that had erupted in Alexandria in approximately 318 CE, when the specific priest Arius began to teach that the specific Son of God, Jesus Christ, was not co-eternal with the specific God the Father but had been created by the Father at a specific point in time. A specific position whose particular logical clarity, the specific Arian theology, was easy to preach and easy to understand, made it enormously popular throughout the specific Eastern Mediterranean Church, and created the specific division that Constantine, whose particular conversion to Christianity had made the specific welfare of the Church a matter of imperial concern, found intolerable. The specific outcome of the Council of Nicaea was the specific Nicene Creed, the particular doctrinal statement whose specific formulation, declaring the Son to be of one substance with the Father, the specific Greek term homoousios whose particular philosophical implications would be debated for another half-century, constituted the specific first authoritative definition of Christian orthodoxy and the specific first attempt by the specific institutional church, backed by the specific power of the Roman state, to define the specific boundaries of acceptable Christian belief and to designate those who fell outside those specific boundaries as heretics whose particular teachings were to be suppressed. The specific significance of Nicaea extends beyond the specific theological question it addressed. It represents the specific moment at which the specific relationship between the Christian Church and the specific political power of the state was formalized in a way whose particular consequences, the specific Constantinian settlement that made Christianity the specific favored, and eventually the specific official religion of the Roman Empire, would shape the specific history of Western civilization for the next 17 centuries. Creating the specific entanglement of religious authority and political power whose particular effects, for good and for ill, are still being worked out in the specific political and religious landscape of the present day. Fact 16. The fall of Rome and the rise of medieval Christianity. The specific collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the particular process whose conventional date of 476 CE, the specific year in which the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor Romulus Augustulus, marks only the specific most visible moment of a specific longer transformation that had been underway for at least a century. Did not produce the specific collapse of Christianity in the Western world, but rather the specific conditions for the particular form of Christian civilization that would dominate Western Europe for the next millennium. The specific medieval synthesis of Roman legal and administrative tradition, Germanic warrior culture, and Christian theology that the specific historian Henry Pion called the specific birth of Europe. The specific institution that carried the specific Roman Christian tradition through the specific turbulence of the 5th and 6th centuries, and transmitted it to the specific successor kingdoms of the Germanic peoples was not the specific imperial government, which had ceased to function in the West, but the specific Roman Church, whose particular bishop, the Pope, retained in the specific city of Rome the specific prestige of the ancient capital, and gradually accumulated the specific religious and political authority that would make the medieval papacy the specific most powerful institution in Western Europe. The specific monastic movement, whose particular origins lie in the specific desert communities of Egypt and Syria in the 3rd and 4th centuries, the specific first Christian monks being individuals who retreated from the specific world to the specific desert in search of the specific encounter with God that the specific noise and comfort of ordinary social life seemed to prevent, was transformed by the specific rule of Saint Benedict. Written in approximately 530 CE for the specific community of Monte Cassino in Italy, into the specific institutional form of Western monasticism, whose particular combination of communal life, structured prayer, manual labor, and the specific preservation and copying of manuscripts made the specific Benedictine monasteries the specific primary centers of literacy, scholarship, and agricultural innovation in the specific early medieval West. Preserving the specific intellectual heritage of classical civilization through the specific centuries of political fragmentation that followed the specific fall of Rome. Fact 17. The Islamic Golden Age, when religion and science were one. The specific period known as the Islamic Golden Age, the particular era of intellectual, scientific, and cultural flourishing, whose conventional dates span approximately from the specific founding of the Abbasid Caliphate in 750 CE to the specific Mongol sack of Baghdad in 1258 CE, though the specific cultural flowering it represents was by no means uniform in its geography or its chronology. With specific centers of learning in the specific cities of Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and Samarkand, each having their specific own particular periods of particular intensity, represents the specific most consequential episode in the specific history of the relationship between religious civilization and scientific inquiry before the specific European scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, its particular achievements in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, philosophy, and the specific preservation and transmission of Greek scientific and philosophical texts, constituting the specific foundation on which the specific European Renaissance would subsequently build. The specific theological motivation for the specific pursuit of knowledge in the Islamic Golden Age was provided by the particular hadith, the specific reported saying of the Prophet Muhammad that commanded believers to seek knowledge, even unto China, a specific formulation whose particular breadth and whose specific elevation of learning to a religious obligation created the specific intellectual culture in which the specific translation movement of the 8th and 9th centuries. The specific systematic translation into Arabic of the specific Greek, Persian, and Indian scientific and philosophical texts, whose particular recovery would transform European intellectual life in the specific 12th and 13th centuries, was understood not as secular activity, but as the specific fulfillment of a religious duty. The specific scholars of the Islamic Golden Age, Ibn Sina, whose specific canon of medicine remained the specific standard medical textbook in both the Islamic world and Europe for 6 centuries. Al-Khwarizmi, whose specific treatise on calculation gave algebra its specific name, and the specific Western world its specific mathematical methodology. Ibn al-Haytham, whose specific book of optics established the specific empirical foundations of the science of vision, understood their specific scientific work as an act of worship, the specific investigation of the natural world as the specific reading of the signs that God had placed in creation for those with the specific eyes to see them. Fact 18. The Crusades, when Christianity went to war. The specific Crusades, the particular series of religiously motivated military expeditions, launched by the specific Latin Christian powers of Western Europe against the specific Muslim rulers of the Holy Land between 1096 and 1291 CE, and extended by subsequent usage to encompass the specific related campaigns against the specific pagan peoples of the Baltic, the specific Muslim rulers of the Iberian Peninsula, and the specific internal Christian enemies designated as heretics by the specific authority of the papacy, represent the specific most dramatic and the specific most morally complex episode in the specific long history of the relationship between religious belief and organized violence. Their particular legacy, the specific subject of heated debate, not only among the specific historians who study them, but among the specific contemporary religious and political communities, whose particular sense of identity is still partly defined by their relationship to those specific events. The specific First Crusade, launched by Pope Urban II at the specific Council of Clermont in 1095, in response to the specific appeal of the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I for military assistance against the specific Seljuk Turks, and animated by the specific promise of plenary indulgence, the specific remission of the temporal penalties for sin, for those who took the cross, succeeded against the specific expectations of most contemporaries. In capturing Jerusalem in 1099, the specific culminating moment of the specific campaign being marked by the specific massacre of the city's Muslim and Jewish inhabitants, whose particular brutality shocked even some specific contemporary Christian observers. The specific theological framework within which the specific Crusades were justified, the specific concept of holy war, the specific idea that violence undertaken in defense of the specific Christian faith and in service of the specific Christian community could be not merely permissible but meritorious, could constitute the specific equivalent of the specific monastic renunciation of the world, was developed in the specific century before the First Crusade by the specific theologians of the Western Church, and represents the specific most consequential specific theological innovation of the medieval period. Its particular legacy visible, not only in the specific subsequent history of Christian just war theory, but in the specific contemporary phenomenon of religiously motivated political violence in every major religious tradition. Fact 19. The Protestant Reformation, Christianity divides. The specific Protestant Reformation, the particular religious revolution whose conventional beginning is located in the specific act of the German Augustinian monk Martin Luther, who on October 31, 1517, according to the specific tradition that subsequent Lutheranism made central to its founding narrative, posted his specific 95 Theses on the specific door of the castle church in Wittenberg. Challenging the specific theology and the specific practice of the sale of indulgences, whose particular abuse Luther understood as a specific symptom of the deeper corruption of the specific late medieval church, was not, in its specific origins, a specific attempt to divide Western Christianity, but a specific attempt to reform it from within. A specific call to return to what Luther understood as the specific authentic teaching of the specific New Testament, against the specific accumulated traditions and the specific institutional corruptions that he believed had obscured it. The specific theological core of the specific Lutheran Reformation was the particular doctrine of justification by faith alone, the specific claim that the specific human being is reconciled to God not through the specific performance of religious works, not through the specific mediation of the specific ecclesiastical institution, and not through the specific purchase of the specific spiritual benefits that the specific late medieval church had made available for money, but through the specific trust, glob, faith, in the specific promise of God, whose particular reliability rests not on the specific worthiness of the believer, but on the specific character of God alone. The specific invention of the printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in approximately 1440, whose particular consequence for the specific dissemination of the specific Reformation's ideas was transformative. The specific Luther's treatises circulating in the specific thousands of printed copies within weeks of their composition, in a way that the specific earlier reform movements of Jan Hus and John Wycliffe, working before the specific age of print, had been unable to achieve. Created the specific first mass media event in the specific history of Western Christianity, making the specific Reformation the specific first religious controversy in which the specific opinion of the specific literate general public became a specific decisive factor in the specific outcome. The specific fracturing of Western Christianity that the Reformation produced into the specific Lutheran, Reformed, Anglican and Anabaptist traditions, whose particular theological and ecclesiological differences would generate the specific wars of religion that devastated Europe in the specific 16th and 17th centuries, created the specific pluralistic religious landscape of the specific modern West, whose particular political and philosophical consequences, including the specific development of the specific concept of religious toleration and the specific separation of church and state, are the specific direct inheritance of the specific age of religious conflict that the Reformation inaugurated. Fact 20. Religion at 20. 20 facts into the history of religion, and the specific shape of the story has grown larger and more complex, as it will continue to do, fact by fact, century by century, through the specific 80 facts that remain. We have watched Christianity born in the specific margins of the Roman Empire and grown, through the specific conversion of Constantine, into the specific official faith of that empire, and then watched it fracture, 1,000 years later, under the specific pressure of its own accumulated contradictions, into the specific Protestant and Catholic traditions whose particular conflict would reshape the specific political map of Europe. We have heard the specific voice of the Prophet Mohammed receive the specific revelation that would become the Quran, and watched the specific community he founded expand in a single century to encompass the specific territories of 3 continents. We have followed the specific Dharma of the Buddha along the specific trade routes of the Silk Road to the specific kingdoms of China and Japan, carried by the specific monks whose particular willingness to walk the specific thousands of miles of road between the specific civilization of India and the specific civilization of East Asia constitutes one of the specific most extraordinary acts of cultural transmission in the specific history of religion. We have stood in the specific fire temples of Zoroaster and recognized the specific first articulation of the specific ideas, the specific cosmic struggle between good and evil, the specific resurrection of the dead, the specific final judgment that would pass into the specific bloodstream of the Abrahamic traditions and shape the specific imagination of more than half the people alive on Earth today. We have also stood at the specific sites of religious violence, the specific walls of Jerusalem in 1099, the specific burned manuscripts of the specific libraries that conquest destroyed, and recognized that the specific history of religion is not only the specific history of the specific highest aspirations of the specific human spirit, but also the specific history of the specific darkest uses to which those aspirations have been put. 80 facts remain. The story does not simplify, it deepens, rest in the darkness. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 21, the Counter-Reformation, Rome responds. The specific Catholic response to the Protestant Reformation, the particular movement of internal reform and theological clarification, known as the Counter-Reformation, whose institutional center was the Council of Trent, convened in 3 distinct periods between 1545 and 1563 in the specific northern Italian city from which it takes its name, was not merely a defensive reaction to the specific challenge of Lutheranism and Calvinism, but a genuine and consequential renewal of Catholic life, whose particular achievements transformed the specific character of the Church that emerged from the specific 16th century. The specific Council of Trent clarified Catholic doctrine on every specific point that the Protestant reformers had contested, affirming the specific authority of both Scripture and tradition, not Scripture alone, affirming the specific role of works alongside faith in justification, affirming the specific real presence of Christ in the Eucharist, and affirming the specific 7 sacraments that Lutheran theology had reduced to 2. The specific Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, founded by the specific Basque soldier turned mystic Ignatius of Loyola in 1540, became the specific most effective instrument of Catholic renewal. Their particular combination of rigorous intellectual formation, absolute obedience to the papacy, and the specific spiritual exercises that Ignatius developed as a method of interior transformation, making them the specific most effective missionaries, educators, and controversialists the Catholic world possessed. The specific Baroque art that the Counter-Reformation sponsored, the specific overwhelming emotional power of Bernini's sculptures, Caravaggio's dramatic use of light, was itself a specific theological argument, an appeal to the specific senses and the specific emotions against the specific Protestant suspicion of images, insisting that beauty was a specific path to God rather than a specific obstacle to Him. Fact 22, the 30 Years' War, when religion tore Europe apart. The specific 30 Years' War, the particular conflict fought primarily on the specific territory of the Holy Roman Empire between 1618 and 1648. Beginning as a specific religious war between the specific Catholic Habsburg dynasty and the specific Protestant princes of Germany, and gradually expanding into the specific general European conflict, in which the specific Catholic Kingdom of France allied with the specific Protestant powers against the specific Habsburg domination of the continent, was the specific most devastating European war before the 20th century. Killing by the specific most careful modern estimates between 1/4 and 1/3 of the specific population of the German lands, through the specific combined effects of combat, famine, and the specific epidemic disease that followed armies through the specific devastated landscape. The specific Peace of Westphalia that ended the conflict in 1648 is understood by historians as one of the specific founding documents of the specific modern international order. The particular principle it established, that the specific sovereign states of Europe would recognize each other's right to determine their own religious and political arrangements, without the specific interference of external powers claiming universal authority, created the specific framework of state sovereignty, whose particular consequences, the specific separation of religious from political authority that the specific Westphalian settlement institutionalized, laid the specific foundation for the specific secular political order of the modern world. The specific lesson that Europe drew from the 30 Years' War, that the specific attempt to impose religious uniformity by force produced catastrophe, that the specific coexistence of different religious communities within the specific same political space was not merely tolerable but necessary, was the specific most consequential religious conclusion of the specific 17th century. Fact 23, the scientific revolution, does the universe need God? Specific scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries, the particular transformation of the specific European understanding of the natural world produced by the specific work of Copernicus, Galileo, Kepler, and Newton, whose particular discovery that the specific universe operates according to specific mathematical laws discoverable by specific human reason, fundamentally altered the specific relationship between religious authority and natural knowledge. Did not, in the specific minds of most of its specific principal figures, constitute an argument against the existence of God, but rather a specific revelation of the extraordinary precision and rationality of the divine mind that had designed the specific universe. The specific Isaac Newton, whose particular Principia Mathematica of 1687 established the specific laws of motion and universal gravitation that provided the specific mathematical foundation of the new science, devoted more of his specific written output to theology than to mathematics, understood his specific scientific work as the specific reading of the second book of God's revelation alongside the specific first book of Scripture, and was deeply preoccupied throughout his specific life with the specific questions of biblical prophecy and the specific nature of the divine. The specific conflict between the specific Roman Inquisition and the specific astronomer Galileo Galilei, whose particular trial in 1633 for the specific crime of teaching the specific Copernican heliocentric system, in defiance of the specific 1616 prohibition issued by the specific Congregation of the Index, has been retold so many specific times as the specific definitive illustration of the specific conflict between religion and science that its particular complexity has been largely obscured. The specific dispute was as much about the specific authority of the Church to define the limits of natural philosophy as about the specific truth of the heliocentric system, and its specific outcome, the specific forced recantation of an old and sick man, did not prevent the specific Copernican system from becoming the specific dominant model of the solar system within a generation. Fact 24. The Enlightenment, reason challenges faith. The specific intellectual movement known as the Enlightenment, the particular European philosophical tradition of the 18th century, whose specific central commitment, the specific supremacy of human reason as the specific proper arbiter of truth in every domain including the specific domain of religion, produced the specific most sustained and the specific most consequential challenge to the specific authority of revealed religion in the entire history of Western thought. Did not emerge from nothing, but from the specific particular conditions created by the specific confluence of the scientific revolution, the specific wars of religion, and the specific expanding knowledge of the specific non-European world that the specific age of exploration had produced, each of these specific developments contributing the specific particular element, the specific model of reason triumphant over superstition, the specific horror of religiously motivated violence, and the specific awareness of the specific diversity of religious traditions, whose particular variety seemed to relativize the specific claims of any single one of them, that combined to create the specific Enlightenment critique of religion. The specific Enlightenment produced three specific positions toward religion whose particular influence on the specific subsequent history of the relationship between religion and secular thought has been decisive. The specific deism of Voltaire and the specific American founders, who retained the specific belief in a creator God whose particular existence was demonstrable by reason, while rejecting the specific revealed doctrines and the specific institutional authority of the specific historical churches. The specific skepticism of David Hume, whose specific dialogues concerning natural religion subjected the specific traditional arguments for the existence of God to a specific philosophical critique from which they have never fully recovered. And the specific atheism of the specific Baron de Holbach, whose specific system of nature of 1770 argued that the specific universe required no supernatural explanation, and that the specific belief in God was the specific product of fear and the specific instrument of political oppression. Each of these positions remains alive and contested in the specific intellectual landscape of the specific present day. Fact 25. Hinduism, a religion without a founder. Hinduism, the particular religious tradition, whose specific name, derived from the specific Persian word for the inhabitants of the specific region beyond the Indus River, is itself a specific relatively recent external designation for what its specific practitioners have traditionally understood not as a specific single religion, but as the specific Sanatana Dharma. The particular eternal law or eternal order whose specific scope encompasses the specific entire range of the specific Indian religious and philosophical tradition, from the specific Vedic hymns of 1500 BCE to the specific devotional poetry of the medieval Bhakti saints, is the specific third largest religion in the world today. With approximately 1.2 billion adherents, concentrated primarily in the specific Indian subcontinent, but present in significant numbers in the specific diaspora communities of the specific United Kingdom, the United States, Southeast Asia, and the specific Caribbean. The specific extraordinary diversity of Hindu belief and practice, which encompasses the specific strict non-dualism of Advaita Vedanta, in which the specific individual self and the specific divine reality are ultimately identical, the specific qualified non-dualism of Vishishtadvaita, in which the specific individual self and God are distinct but inseparable. The specific theistic devotionalism of the specific Vaishnava and Shaiva traditions, in which the specific personal God of love and grace is the specific supreme reality. And the specific goddess traditions of the Shakta schools, in which the specific divine feminine principle is the specific ultimate ground of all existence, reflects the specific absence of the specific centralizing institutional structures of creed, canon, and clergy that have historically defined the specific boundaries of the Abrahamic traditions. What holds the specific extraordinarily diverse Hindu tradition together is not the specific agreement of a specific creed, but the specific shared reference to the specific Vedic tradition, the specific authority of the Brahmin priesthood, the specific system of social organization associated with the specific caste system, and the specific common ritual calendar, whose particular festivals structure the specific lived religious experience of the Hindu community across its specific vast internal diversity. Fact 26. Sikhism, the religion of the eternal Guru. Sikhism, the specific religious tradition founded by Guru Nanak, born in 1469 in the specific village of Talwandi, in what is now the specific Pakistani province of Punjab, whose particular teaching, that there is one God, that all human beings are equal before that God, that the specific caste distinctions of Hinduism and the specific communal divisions of Islam are obstacles to the specific direct experience of the divine that is available to every human being regardless of their specific birth, drew on both the specific Hindu devotional tradition of the Bhakti movement and the specific Islamic Sufi tradition of mystical love to create a specific synthesis whose particular character, neither Hindu nor Muslim, but the specific product of the specific encounter between both, has led to its specific mischaracterization as a specific blend of the two, when it is in specific theological terms an independent religious vision with its own specific integrity. The specific institution of the Guru, the particular chain of 10 human gurus from Guru Nanak to Guru Gobind Singh, who died in 1708 and declared that the specific living Guru would henceforth be the specific Guru Granth Sahib, the specific holy scripture of Sikhism, is central to the specific Sikh understanding of religious authority, the particular scripture being treated not as a specific text to be read, but as a specific living presence to be encountered. Installed in the specific Gurdwara on a specific raised platform, covered with a specific canopy, and read continuously in specific relay by specific trained readers. The specific founding of the Khalsa, the particular community of initiated Sikhs, established by the specific 10th Guru Gobind Singh in 1699, whose members are identified by the specific 5 articles of faith, including the specific uncut hair covered by the specific turban. Transformed Sikhism from the specific peaceful devotional community of the first Gurus into the specific community of saint soldiers, whose particular identity has been shaped by the specific experience of persecution, resistance, and the specific defense of the specific freedom to practice one's faith. Fact 27. Confucianism, the religion of proper relationships. Confucianism, the particular intellectual and ethical tradition based on the specific teachings of Kongqiu, known in the Western world by the specific Latinized name Confucius, who was born in the specific state of Lu, in what is now the specific Chinese province of Shandong, in 551 BCE, and who spent the specific decades of his adult life teaching. Traveling between the specific competing states of the specific Zhou dynasty in search of a ruler who would implement his specific vision of good governance, and reflecting on the specific classical texts of the specific earlier Chinese tradition, whose particular study he understood as the specific foundation of the specific moral formation he sought to cultivate, occupies a specific ambiguous position in the specific comparative study of religion. Since the specific question of whether it is a religion or a philosophy or a system of social ethics is one whose particular answer depends on the specific definition of religion being employed, and one whose specific resolution has been contested by both the specific Chinese tradition itself and the specific Western scholars who have studied it. The specific core of the Confucian teaching is the specific concept of Ren, variously translated as benevolence, humaneness, or the specific quality of being fully human, whose particular cultivation through the specific practice of ritual propriety, lei, the specific cultivation of filial piety toward parents and ancestors, and the specific study of the specific classical texts constitutes the specific Confucian path to the specific fully realized human life. The specific influence of Confucianism on the specific political and social structures of East Asia, the specific examination system, through which the specific Chinese imperial state selected its specific officials on the basis of specific mastery of the specific Confucian classics, persisting from the specific Han Dynasty until 1905. The specific emphasis on education, family loyalty, and deference to legitimate authority that has shaped the specific social values of China, Korea, Japan, and Vietnam makes it one of the specific most consequential intellectual traditions in the specific history of human civilization, regardless of the specific question of whether it qualifies as a religion in the strict sense. Fact 28. Taoism, the way that cannot be named. Taoism, the specific Chinese religious and philosophical tradition, whose particular intellectual origins lie in the specific text known as the Tao Te Ching, attributed by tradition to the specific figure of Laozi, a specific archivist of the specific Zhou dynasty court, who is said to have composed the specific 81 chapters of the text when departing China for the West, and whose specific historicity is disputed by modern scholars, is at once the specific most elusive and the specific most immediately recognizable of the major world religions, its particular central concept. The Tao, the way, the specific unnameable principle that underlies and pervades all things. Being defined by the specific opening lines of its specific founding text with the specific paradox that the Tao that can be told is not the eternal Tao. Establishing from the specific first breath of the specific tradition, the specific priority of direct experience over doctrinal formulation that distinguishes Taoist spirituality from the specific creedal traditions of the West. The specific Tao Te Ching's teaching that the specific natural world operates according to the specific principle of Wu Wei, the specific non-action or effortless action in which the specific human being aligns with the specific natural flow of things, rather than imposing the specific will and the specific rational mind upon them, created the specific distinctive Taoist ethos of simplicity, spontaneity, and the specific attentiveness to the specific rhythms of the natural world that expressed itself in the specific Chinese traditions of landscape painting, calligraphy, martial arts, and the specific practices of inner cultivation whose particular goal is the specific direct experience of the Tao. The specific religious Taoism that developed alongside and in complex relationship with the specific philosophical Taoism of the Tao Te Ching, incorporating the specific elaborate pantheon of Taoist deities, the specific practices of ritual, alchemy, and the specific cultivation of longevity, represents the specific popular and institutional face of a tradition whose particular interior range extends from the specific cosmic metaphysics of the Tao Te Ching to the specific practical techniques of the specific adepts who sought, through the specific cultivation of breath, movement, and mind, to align themselves with the specific eternal principle that underlies all things. Fact 29. Indigenous religions, the sacred world of traditional peoples. The specific religious traditions of the world's indigenous peoples, the particular diverse and extraordinarily varied complex of beliefs, practices, cosmologies, and ritual systems through which the specific communities of Aboriginal Australians, Native Americans, African traditional religionists, Pacific Islanders, and the specific indigenous peoples of the Americas, Asia, and the Arctic have understood and maintained their specific relationships with the specific natural world. Their specific ancestors, and the specific spiritual forces whose particular presence in the specific landscape they inhabit has been experienced not as an occasional intrusion into an otherwise secular world, but as the specific constant and specific immediate context of every specific aspect of daily life, constitute, collectively, the specific oldest layer of the specific human religious heritage. Their particular roots extending to the specific period before the specific development of writing, agriculture, and the specific state-level societies in which the specific world religions originated. The specific most widely shared features of indigenous religious traditions, the specific understanding of the natural world as alive with the specific presence of spiritual agencies whose particular relationship with human beings requires specific ongoing maintenance through the specific practices of prayer, offering, and ritual. The specific role of the shaman or medicine person as the specific specialist in the specific techniques of altered consciousness through which the specific boundary between the ordinary and the spirit world can be crossed. The specific centrality of the specific land as a sacred entity whose particular features, mountains, rivers, forests, specific animals, are the specific dwelling places of the specific spiritual powers on whom the specific community depends. And the specific importance of the specific ancestors, whose particular continuing presence in the specific life of the community is maintained through the specific rituals of remembrance and the specific oral tradition that carries their specific stories forward. reflect a specific understanding of the relationship between the sacred and the natural that the specific world religions have often lost, and that the specific ecological crisis of the present moment has made newly urgent. Indigenous religious traditions are not relics of the human past. They are specific living wisdom traditions whose particular insights into the specific relationship between human beings and the specific natural world constitute a specific irreplaceable contribution to the specific human understanding of what it means to live well on the earth. Fact 30, Religion at 30. 30 facts into the history of religion, and the specific map of the human spiritual world has grown vast enough that we must pause, as we have paused at each 10th fact, to take our bearings in the specific darkness. We have watched the specific Western Church fracture under the specific pressure of the Protestant Reformation, and watched the specific Catholic tradition renew itself in response. We have stood at the specific edge of the Enlightenment and heard the specific voice of human reason assert, for the specific first time in the history of Western civilization, its specific right to judge the specific claims of revealed religion by its own specific standards. We have entered the specific extraordinary diversity of the Hindu tradition, followed the specific founding of Sikhism in the specific encounter between the specific devotional traditions of India, and sat with the specific paradoxical teaching of the Tao that the specific deepest truth cannot be spoken. We have listened to the specific voices of the specific indigenous traditions whose particular understanding of the sacred world, the specific world in which the specific land is alive, the specific ancestors are present, and the specific human community is embedded in a specific web of relationships that extends beyond the specific human, represents the specific oldest and the specific most immediately threatened layer of the specific human religious heritage. What emerges from these 30 facts is not a single story but a specific recognition that the specific impulse to seek the sacred, to mark the specific boundary between the ordinary and the extraordinary, to ask what is asked of us by the specific fact of our existence, is not the specific property of any single tradition but the specific common inheritance of the entire human species. 70 facts remain. The story deepens still. Rest now. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 31. The Age of Missions. Christianity crosses the ocean. The specific era of Christian missionary expansion that accompanied the specific European colonial project from the specific late 15th century onward, the particular process by which the specific Catholic religious orders of the Franciscans, Dominicans, and Jesuits followed the specific Spanish and Portuguese conquistadors into the specific Americas, Africa, and Asia, and by which the specific Protestant missionary societies of the 18th and 19th centuries penetrated the specific interior of Africa, the specific islands of the Pacific, and the specific hinterlands of India and China, constitutes the specific largest geographic expansion of a single religious tradition in the specific history of religion, transforming Christianity from a religion concentrated in Europe and the specific Near East into the specific genuinely global tradition it is today. The specific methods of the specific Catholic missionaries ranged from the specific accommodation strategy of the Jesuit Mateo Rixai in China, who learned the specific Chinese language, adopted the specific dress of a Confucian scholar, and sought to present Christianity as the specific fulfillment of the specific best of the Confucian tradition, to the specific coercive baptisms and the specific destruction of indigenous temples and sacred objects that characterized the specific conquest of the specific Americas, where the specific encomienda system bound indigenous labor to the specific colonial economy and the specific church simultaneously. The specific legacy of the missionary era is not simple. The specific missionaries who opposed the specific enslavement of indigenous peoples, Bartolomé de las Casas among the specific most famous, were also products of the specific colonial system, whose particular assumptions about the specific superiority of European Christian civilization shaped their specific understanding of what they were offering the specific peoples they encountered. The specific churches that the specific missionary era planted in Africa, Asia, and the Americas are today the specific most rapidly growing Christian communities on earth. Their particular vitality, a specific reminder that the specific history of religious transmission is never only the specific history of imposition, but also the specific history of reception, adaptation, and the specific creative transformation of the specific received tradition. Fact 32. African traditional religions, the sacred web of life. The specific religious traditions of sub-Saharan Africa, the particular diverse complex of beliefs, cosmologies, rituals, and moral systems through which the specific hundreds of distinct African peoples have understood their relationships with the specific divine, the specific natural world, and the specific community of the living and the dead. constitute one of the specific most misrepresented and the specific most consequential bodies of religious thought in the specific history of humanity, their particular systematic distortion by the specific European colonial and missionary traditions, which designated them uniformly as animism or fetishism or paganism, in ways that denied their specific theological sophistication and their specific moral seriousness. Having only recently begun to be corrected by the specific serious scholarly and theological attention they deserve. The specific features most widely shared across the specific diverse African religious traditions include the specific belief in a supreme being, variously named Olodumare among the specific Yoruba, Mweri among the specific Shona, and Ngai among the specific Kikuyu, whose particular transcendence is so complete that direct worship is addressed not to the specific supreme being directly, but to the specific intermediary spiritual powers. The specific ancestors and the specific lesser divinities, whose particular accessibility makes them the specific practical focus of ritual life. The specific centrality of the specific ancestors, the particular community of the dead, whose continuing presence in the specific life of the living, is maintained through the specific rituals of remembrance, the specific libations poured, and the specific prayers addressed to them, reflects the specific African understanding of the specific community as extending across the specific boundary of death. The specific living and the specific dead constituting together the specific single community, whose specific welfare the specific rituals of religion exist to maintain. The specific African religious traditions were carried by the specific enslaved Africans across the Atlantic to the specific Americas, where they survived in the specific transformed but recognizable forms of candomblé in Brazil, Vodou in Haiti, and Santeria in Cuba, the specific most enduring testimony to the specific resilience of religious tradition under the specific most extreme conditions of oppression. Fact 33. Mysticism, the direct experience of the sacred. The specific phenomenon of mysticism, the particular dimension of religious experience in which the specific individual reports the specific direct, unmediated encounter with the specific ultimate reality that the specific tradition designates as God, the Tao, Brahman, Nirvana, or the specific sacred ground of being, is the specific point at which the specific boundaries between the specific world religions become most permeable. The specific descriptions given by the specific Christian mystic Meister Eckhart, the specific Jewish mystic of the Kabbalah, the specific Islamic Sufi, the specific Hindu practitioner of Advaita Vedanta, and the specific Buddhist meditator converging on the specific same cluster of experiences, the specific dissolution of the boundary between self and other. The specific sense of a reality, both more intimate than any specific ordinary perception, and more vast than the specific entire cosmos, the specific quality of the specific encounter as something not constructed by the specific mind, but encountered by it, with a specificity that has led some scholars to propose the specific existence of a common mystical core beneath the specific doctrinal diversity of the specific world religions. The specific great mystics of the Christian tradition, Meister Eckhart, whose specific sermons on the specific birth of the Word in the specific soul of the believer brought him to the specific attention of the specific Inquisition. The specific Spanish Carmelites Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, whose specific accounts of the specific stages of the specific interior life remain the specific most precise, and the specific most psychologically acute maps of the specific mystical path in the specific Western tradition. And the specific English anchorist Julian of Norwich, whose specific revelations of divine love, composed after a specific series of visions, received during a specific near-death illness, contains the specific most tender and the specific most theologically daring affirmation of the specific love of God in the specific history of Christian mysticism. Were not peripheral figures in the specific history of their specific tradition, but the specific most intense expressions of the specific central impulse of religion, the specific desire not merely to believe in God, but to know God directly. Fact 34. The Kabbalah, Judaism's mystical tradition. The specific mystical tradition within Judaism known as Kabbalah, the particular body of esoteric teaching, whose specific claim to represent the specific secret oral tradition transmitted from the specific time of Moses, though its specific literary history suggests a specific development between the 2nd century CE and the specific flowering of the specific classical Kabbalistic texts in the specific Jewish communities of medieval Provence and Spain. Culminating in the specific composition of the Zohar, the specific most important Kabbalistic text, attributed to the specific 2nd century Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, but understood by modern scholars to have been composed primarily by the specific Spanish Kabbalist Moses de Leon in the specific late 13th century. represents the specific most elaborate and the specific most philosophically ambitious attempt within the Abrahamic traditions to describe the specific interior life of the divine and the specific nature of the specific relationship between the specific infinite God and the specific finite creation. The specific central symbol of the Kabbalah is the specific tree of life, the particular diagram of the specific 10 Sephirot, the specific divine attributes or emanations through which the specific infinite and unknowable God, Ein Sof, the specific without end, makes contact with the specific created world. The specific Sephirot arranged in a specific pattern whose particular structure encodes the specific Kabbalistic understanding of the specific nature of divine creativity, the specific structure of the human soul, and the specific path of the specific mystical ascent toward the specific divine source. The specific Lurianic Kabbalah developed by Isaac Luria in the specific mystical community of Safed in 16th century Palestine introduced the specific concepts of Tzimtzum, the specific divine self-contraction that created the specific space in which the universe could exist, and Tikkun Olam, the specific repair of the world through the specific performance of the commandments and the specific elevation of the specific divine sparks scattered through the specific creation. A specific idea whose particular influence on subsequent Jewish thought, from the specific Hasidic movement of the 18th century to the specific contemporary Jewish social justice tradition, has been profound. Fact 35. The Reformation of Islam, Sufism and its critics. The specific tradition within Islam known as Sufism, the particular path of interior purification and direct experience of the divine, whose specific origins lie in the specific ascetic and devotional practices of the specific early Muslim community of the 7th and 8th centuries, and whose specific development into the specific organized brotherhoods, tariqas, that became the specific primary vehicle of the specific popular and the specific missionary Islam of the medieval and early modern periods, transformed the specific character of Islamic religious life across the specific vast geographic range from West Africa to Southeast Asia, represents the specific most significant internal development in the specific history of Islam after the specific initial articulation of the specific theological and legal tradition, its particular emphasis on the specific interior dimensions of religious practice, the specific purification of the specific heart from the specific attachment to worldly things, the specific cultivation of the specific love of God that the specific Sufi masters understood as the specific true meaning of the specific Quranic injunction to remember God always, generating the specific most beloved body of religious poetry in the specific history of the Islamic world. The specific Sufi poet Jalal ad-Din Rumi, whose specific Masnavi, composed in the specific Anatolian city of Konya in the specific 13th century, is the specific longest mystical poem in the specific Persian language, and whose particular imagery of the specific soul's longing for its specific divine source has made him the specific most widely read poet in the specific contemporary English-speaking world. Expressed the specific Sufi understanding of religion not as the specific performance of external obligations, but as the specific burning interior desire for the specific encounter with the beloved whose particular satisfaction no specific human relationship can provide. The specific tension between the specific Sufi emphasis on interior experience and direct access to the specific divine, and the specific Orthodox Islamic emphasis on the specific authority of scripture and law, has generated the specific most significant internal theological controversy in the specific history of Islam, a specific controversy whose particular contemporary manifestation, the specific Salafi and Wahhabi movements' systematic opposition to the specific Sufi shrines and practices, continues to shape the specific landscape of the specific Islamic world today. Fact 36. Religion and the abolition of slavery. The specific relationship between religion and the specific institution of slavery. The particular complex and morally charged history in which the specific religious traditions of the Western world both provided the specific theological justifications that the specific slaveholding societies used to legitimate the specific enslavement of African people, and generated the specific most powerful moral arguments and the specific most committed individual activists whose particular efforts brought the specific institution to an end, is one of the specific most consequential and the specific most uncomfortable chapters in the specific history of religion in the Western world. The specific biblical curse of Ham, invoked by the specific defenders of slavery in the specific antebellum American South as the specific divinely ordained justification for the specific racial hierarchy of the specific slave system. The specific natural law tradition of Thomas Aquinas, whose particular argument that some human beings are by nature suited to be governed by others, was adapted by the specific theologians of the specific colonial period to justify the specific enslavement of the specific peoples, whom the specific colonial project had designated as racially and culturally inferior. These specific theological resources were real, specific, and specific in their historical consequences. But against them must be set the specific William Wilberforce, the specific evangelical Anglican MP whose particular campaign against the specific British slave trade, sustained through the specific decades of the specific late 18th and early 19th centuries, finally achieved the specific abolition of the British slave trade in 1807, the specific Quakers, who became the specific first religious community to condemn slavery categorically, and the specific African American religious tradition, whose particular theology of liberation, rooted in the specific Exodus narrative of the specific Hebrew Bible, in which the specific God of Israel hears the specific cry of the specific enslaved and acts to set them free, sustained the specific human dignity of the specific enslaved, and provided the specific moral foundation of the specific abolitionist movement. Fact 37. New religious movements, faith in the modern world. The specific phenomenon of new religious movements, the particular diverse range of specific religious traditions that have emerged since the specific late 18th century outside the specific established boundaries of the specific world religions, including the specific Latter-day Saints, the specific Jehovah's Witnesses, the specific Seventh-day Adventists, the specific Baha'i Faith, the specific various traditions grouped under the specific umbrella of the New Age movement, and the specific thousands of specific independent charismatic and Pentecostal churches, whose particular proliferation in the specific global South has transformed the specific religious map of the specific contemporary world, reflects the specific persistent and the specific restless human capacity to create new forms of the specific religious life in response to the specific conditions of the specific historical moment in which it finds itself. The specific Baha'i Faith, founded by Baha'u'llah, who was born in Tehran in 1817, and who, after the specific years of imprisonment and exile that his specific proclamation of his specific divine mission brought upon him, articulated the specific teaching that all the specific world religions are the specific successive revelations of a single God whose particular purpose is the specific progressive education of the human race toward the specific unity that the specific Baha'i Faith understands as the specific next stage in the specific spiritual evolution of humanity, is the specific most geographically widespread of the specific new religious movements. Its specific communities present in the specific most countries of any religion in the world after Christianity. The specific Pentecostal movement, which began in the specific Azusa Street Revival in Los Angeles in 1906, and has since grown to encompass an estimated 600 million adherents worldwide, has achieved the specific most rapid demographic expansion in the specific history of religion. Its specific emphasis on the specific direct experience of the Holy Spirit through the specific gifts of speaking in tongues, healing, and prophecy speaking to the specific religious needs of the specific communities, particularly in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America, whose particular encounter with the specific modern world has left the specific traditional religious structures insufficient. Fact 38. The Holocaust, religion in the face of ultimate evil. The specific Holocaust, the particular systematic murder of 6 million Jewish men, women, and children by the specific Nazi regime of Germany and its specific collaborators between 1941 and 1945. The specific most comprehensively documented act of genocidal mass murder in the specific history of humanity poses to the specific theology of every religious tradition that affirms the existence of a good and powerful God, the specific most extreme version of the specific problem of evil that has challenged religious thought in every century. How the specific suffering of the specific innocent can be reconciled with the specific existence of a God who is both omnipotent and morally perfect. The specific Jewish theological responses to the Holocaust, the particular range of positions whose specific diversity reflects the specific impossibility of a single adequate answer to an event of this specific magnitude, include the specific death of God theology of Richard Rubinstein, who argued that the specific traditional God of covenant and history could not survive the specific experience of Auschwitz. The specific eclipse of God theology of Martin Buber, who understood the specific silence of God during the Holocaust not as the specific absence of God, but as a specific historical moment of concealment, whose particular meaning could not be grasped from within the specific darkness of the event. And the specific responses of those survivors, among them Elie Wiesel, whose specific memoir night remains the specific most widely read testimony of the specific experience of the camps, who found that the specific traditional language of faith was both inadequate and irreplaceable, the specific only language available for the specific attempt to make meaning in the specific face of what had happened. The Holocaust has also generated the specific most urgent contemporary articulation of the specific obligation of religious traditions to confront and to correct the specific ways in which the specific long history of Christian antisemitism. The specific teaching of contempt for the specific Jewish people that the specific Catholic Church formally repudiated in the specific Second Vatican Council's Declaration Nostra Aetate in 1965 had created the specific cultural conditions in which the specific genocide became possible. Fact 39. Shinto, Japan's ancient way of the gods. Shinto, the specific indigenous religious tradition of Japan whose particular name, written with the specific Chinese characters for way of the gods, distinguishes it from the specific Buddhist tradition imported from China in the 6th century CE, with which it has coexisted in complex and sometimes deeply intertwined relationship throughout the specific subsequent history of Japanese religious life. Is at once the specific oldest continuously practiced religious tradition of the specific Japanese archipelago, its particular roots extending to the specific prehistoric communities of the specific Jomon and Yai periods, whose specific material culture preserves the specific evidence of the specific ritual practices that constitute the specific earliest layer of what would become Shinto, and the specific most distinctively national of the specific world's major religious traditions. Its particular gods, the specific kami, the specific sacred presences that inhabit mountains, rivers, trees, rocks, and specific extraordinary human beings, being understood as the specific divine powers whose particular relationship with the specific Japanese people and the specific Japanese land constitutes the specific foundation of the specific Japanese national identity. The specific kami are not the specific omnipotent creator gods of the Abrahamic traditions, but the specific particular sacred presences that the specific Japanese religious sensibility has perceived in the specific features of the specific natural world, the specific awesomeness of Mount Fuji, the specific purity of a specific mountain stream, the specific extraordinary beauty, or the specific extraordinary power of a specific animal or a specific storm, whose particular veneration requires not the specific doctrinal adherence of the Abrahamic faiths, but the specific ritual purity, the specific sincerity of heart, and the specific regular observance of the specific festivals through which the specific community maintains its specific relationship with the specific kami. The specific Meiji Restoration of 1868, which elevated Shinto to the specific status of state religion, and used it to legitimate the specific imperial nationalism that culminated in the specific Pacific War, represents the specific most consequential and the specific most destructive politicization of a specific religious tradition in the specific history of modern Asia. Its specific legacy, the specific subject of ongoing historical and theological reckoning in the specific contemporary Japan. Fact 40. Religion at 40. 40 facts into the history of religion, and the specific story has grown into something that no single mind can hold entire, a specific vast web of specific human longing, specific human creativity, and specific human failure stretching across every continent and every century. We have followed Christianity across oceans, watching it plant its specific roots in the specific soil of Africa, Asia, and the Americas, sometimes through coercion, sometimes through the specific genuine power of its specific message of love and liberation, always through the specific complex and specific morally unresolved encounter between the specific bearers of the specific tradition and the specific peoples who received it. We have entered the specific interior life of the specific mystical traditions, the specific Christian, Jewish, Islamic, and Hindu pathways toward the specific direct experience of the sacred, and recognized that the specific deepest impulse of religious life is not the specific performance of ritual or the specific assent to doctrine, but the specific hunger for the specific real. We have stood at the specific boundary of the specific Holocaust and recognized that the specific history of religion is not only the specific history of humanity at its specific best, but also the specific history of the specific ways in which the specific religious imagination can be turned toward the specific service of the specific, most complete human evil. What 40 Facts teaches is that religion cannot be summarized, cannot be judged from a single angle, cannot be celebrated without also being interrogated. It is too large for any single verdict. 60 facts remain. The story is only halfway told. Rest now in the specific quiet of this specific moment. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 41. the Second Vatican Council, Catholicism opens its windows. The Second Vatican Council, convened by Pope John XXII in Rome between 1962 and 1965, the most consequential gathering in the history of the Catholic Church since the Council of Trent 4 centuries earlier, attended by more than 2,000 bishops from every continent on earth, transformed the Church's self-understanding, its relationship to modernity, and its posture toward the other religious traditions of humanity in ways whose consequences are still unfolding in every Catholic community in the world. John XXII described his intention with the Italian word aggiornamento, a bringing up to date, an opening of windows that had been closed for a very long time. The Council's reform of the Mass replaced the universal Latin liturgy with worship in the vernacular languages of the faithful, restoring to ordinary Catholics the active participation in the central act of their faith that centuries of a language most of them could not understand had denied them. The Declaration Nostra Aetate, perhaps the single most theologically daring document the Council produced, stated that the Church rejects nothing that is true and holy in the non-Christian religions, recognized the spiritual riches of Hinduism, Buddhism, and Islam with a candor unprecedented in the history of official Catholic teaching, and formally repudiated the collective guilt of the Jewish people for the death of Christ. Reversing a teaching that had poisoned the Christian relationship with Judaism for 19 centuries, and had contributed, however indirectly, to the cultural atmosphere in which the Holocaust became possible. The Council declared that the Church is not a fortress against the world, but the people of God moving through history, a community called not to withdraw from the human conversation, but to enter it fully, bringing what it understands as the light of the gospel to bear on the darkest questions of the modern age. The Council remains the most contested event in 20th century Catholicism. Its reforms are celebrated by some as the long overdue reconciliation of an ancient institution with the world it exists to serve, and condemned by others as a betrayal of the tradition whose continuity is the very foundation of the Church's authority. Both responses reflect how deeply the Council cut, not into peripheral questions, but into the identity of an institution that had understood itself as beyond the reach of historical change. Fact 42. Liberation Theology, the Gospel of the Poor. Liberation theology emerged from the Catholic Church of Latin America in the years immediately following the Second Vatican Council, receiving its name and its most systematic formulation from the Peruvian theologian Gustavo Gutierrez in his landmark 1971 work A Theology of Liberation. A book that did not merely add a new chapter to the existing theological conversation, but reoriented the entire enterprise by insisting that the proper starting point of Christian theology is not the study of doctrine in the abstract, but the encounter with the suffering of the poor in the concrete. Its central claim that the preferential option for the poor is not an optional dimension of Christian living, but its theological center, not a political program grafted onto the gospel, but the gospel's own deepest logic, made it the most politically consequential theological development in 20th century Christianity, its influence extending far beyond Latin America to Black theology in the United States, Dalit theology in India, Minjung theology in South Korea, and feminist theology across the Western churches. Liberation theology begins not with the questions of the academy, but with the questions that arise from the base communities, the small groups of poor Catholics, meeting in the barrios and the favelas of Latin America, who read the Bible together and found in the Exodus narrative not an ancient story, but a living description of their own situation, and who asked with urgency what the God who had heard the cry of the enslaved in Egypt was saying to them now. The theological claim that follows is stark. The God of the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament is not a God who stands equidistant from all parties in the human struggle, but a God who takes sides, who hears the cry of the oppressed and acts in history to set them free. The Vatican's response under John Paul II was sharp. 2 instructions issued by Cardinal Ratzinger in 1984 and 1986 condemned aspects of liberation theology as incompatible with authentic Catholic tradition, objecting particularly to its use of Marxist categories of class analysis. And in March 1980, Archbishop Oscar Romero of San Salvador, who had become the most prominent ecclesiastical voice of the poor in Central America, whose Sunday homilies broadcast on the radio reached hundreds of thousands of listeners, and who had written directly to President Carter asking him to stop arming the Salvadoran military, was shot through the heart by a right-wing death squad as he celebrated Mass at the altar of a hospital chapel. He was canonized by Pope Francis in 2018. His murder remains the clearest illustration in modern religious history of what is at stake when the gospel is preached not to the comfortable, but to the desperate. Fact 43. Religion and Evolution, Darwin's Challenge. The publication of Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species in November 1859 created the most consequential intellectual challenge to traditional religious understandings of creation that Western religion had encountered since the Copernican revolution 3 centuries earlier, and in some respects a more intimate one, because where Copernicus had displaced the Earth from the center of the cosmos, Darwin displaced the human being from the center of creation. Proposing a mechanism for the development of all biological life, including human life, that required no divine intervention at any point in the process, and that described the extraordinary complexity and beauty of the living world as the product not of purposeful design, but of the entirely impersonal forces of random variation and natural selection acting across unimaginable stretches of geological time. The theological implications struck at the foundations of several central religious claims simultaneously. The Genesis account of creation in 6 days was rendered literally untenable by a geological record that described not thousands but billions of years of Earth history. The special creation of the human being in the image of God was complicated beyond simple resolution by the demonstration of human descent from earlier primate ancestors. And the entire framework of natural theology, the tradition, developed most influentially by William Paley in 1802, of inferring the existence and character of God from the design evident in the natural world, was undermined at its root by a mechanism that produced the appearance of design without a designer. The range of religious responses has always been considerably wider than the public debate suggests. Young Earth creationism, the insistence that Genesis describes 6 literal days of creation and that the universe is no more than 10,000 years old, defended in the 20th century by the creation science movement and subsequently by intelligent design theory, represents a minority position even within the evangelical Protestant tradition that is its primary home. The Catholic Church, under the guidance of Pope Pius XII's 1950 encyclical Humani Generis and subsequent papal statements, has accepted the scientific account of biological evolution while maintaining that the spiritual soul of the human person is the direct creation of God and cannot be explained by natural processes alone. The theologian and Jesuit paleontologist Pierre Teilhard de Chardin went further, proposing in works written during his lifetime, but published only after his death, that evolution itself is the unfolding of a cosmic spiritual process, moving through increasing complexity toward what he called the omega point, the final convergence of consciousness in God. The conflict between religion and evolution is genuine in some communities and non-existent in others, a reminder that the two words name not monolithic opponents, but vast territories within which the full range of possible relationships remains open. Fact 44. The rise of secularism when societies leave the church. Secularization, the demographic and cultural shift by which the populations of Western Europe and other developed nations have moved over the course of the 20th and early 21st centuries, away from the high levels of formal religious practice and institutional affiliation that characterized the 19th century toward the lower levels of church attendance, religious belief, and the social influence of religious institutions that characterize the contemporary moment, is the most significant structural change in the religious landscape of the modern world, and among the most debated phenomena in the contemporary sociology of religion. The data is less straightforward than the popular narrative of religion's inevitable decline in the face of modernity suggests. The United States, for most of the 20th century the most economically and technologically developed society in history, maintained levels of religious practice and institutional affiliation characteristic of a much less developed society, attending church at rates that would have seemed unremarkable in 19th century rural England, and professing belief in God at rates exceeding 90% well into the second half of the 20th century. This American exception to the European pattern of secularization was the most important empirical challenge to the secularization thesis as it was originally formulated, forcing its proponents to qualify and complicate the claim that modernization produces secularization as inevitably as industrialization produces urbanization. The global picture is more complex still. While the churches of Western Europe empty, the Church of England baptizing fewer than 10% of English infants by the early 21st century, the Catholic churches of Ireland and Spain losing the generations born after 1980 at rates that would have seemed inconceivable 30 years ago. The Pentecostal churches of Sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America fill with a speed and an intensity that make the African and Latin American Christianity of the 21st century among the most vibrant mass religious phenomena in the history of the world. Religion is not disappearing. It is undergoing one of the most dramatic geographic and demographic redistributions in its history, moving from the North Atlantic world that has dominated it for 5 centuries toward the global South and East, finding new forms and new voices, and continuing to ask, in every language and every landscape it inhabits, the questions that no secular philosophy has yet rendered unnecessary. Fact 45. Fundamentalism, religion's reaction to the modern world. Religious fundamentalism, the style of religious commitment that emerged in the early 20th century as a self-conscious reaction to the perceived threats of secular modernity to the integrity of traditional religious life, and that has since become the most publicly visible and the most politically consequential form of religious expression in the contemporary world, is not, despite the frequency with which the term is applied to traditions of the global South, a product of those traditions. It was invented in the modern West, its name derived from the American Protestant publication, The Fundamentals. A Testimony to the Truth, a series of 90 essays published between 1910 and 1915 by conservative Protestant scholars defending the inerrancy of the Bible against the higher biblical criticism being developed in German universities, and against the Darwinian theory of evolution that American Protestant intellectuals increasingly perceived as an assault on the foundations of Christian civilization. The features that scholars of comparative religion identify as characteristic of fundamentalism across the different traditions in which it appears share a remarkable family resemblance. An appeal to a privileged textual or traditional authority, understood as the recovery of the original and uncorrupted form of the faith against the corruptions introduced by historical change and theological compromise. A sharp and clearly marked boundary between the community of the truly faithful and the corrupted world outside it. An understanding of the present historical moment as one of exceptional cosmic significance, in which the authentic tradition is under existential attack from the forces of secular modernity. And a willingness to use the resources of modernity, mass media, political organization, modern weapons, in the defense of a worldview that presents itself as the rejection of modernity's premises. These features appear with striking consistency across traditions, as theologically different as American Protestant fundamentalism, the political Islam of the Muslim Brotherhood, founded by Hassan al-Banna in Egypt in 1928, the Hindu nationalism of the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh, and the settler theology of the Israeli religious right. Understanding fundamentalism as a recurring mode of religious response to the experience of cultural threat and the loss of certainty, rather than as the essential expression of the traditions in which it appears, is the beginning of the understanding that the phenomenon requires, and that its political consequences in the early 21st century make urgent. Fact 46. Women and religion, the long struggle for sacred equality. The position of women within the world's major religious traditions is the most significant unrectified structural injustice in the history of religion. A judgment that the scale of the injustice, sustained across traditions as theologically different as Roman Catholicism, traditional Islam, Orthodox Judaism, and conservative evangelicalism, and persisting across centuries and continents without the mitigation that similar injustices in other domains of social life have gradually received. Places beyond reasonable dispute. In virtually every major tradition, women have been excluded from the positions of formal religious authority, the priesthood, the rabbinate, the ulama, the ordained ministry, whose possession of the power to perform the sacred rituals and to interpret the sacred texts has constituted, in virtually every major religious civilization, the most consequential form of institutional power available. The theological arguments advanced in defense of this exclusion are varied in their specific content, but uniform in their practical conclusion. The Catholic argument that the priest acts in the person of Christ and must therefore share Christ's maleness. The traditional Jewish arguments rooted in the halakhic categories that historically exempted women from the time-bound commandments whose observance defined the public religious life. The traditional Islamic arguments drawn from the Hadith literature and from the classical legal schools that restricted the imamate in congregational prayer to men. Each of these arguments has been challenged by feminist theologians and religious reformers who argue that the subordination of women in the religious tradition reflects the patriarchal assumptions of the historical context in which those traditions were codified, not the theological core of the traditions themselves. That the God of the Hebrew prophets, who demands justice for the widow and the orphan, cannot coherently be invoked in defense of the institutional exclusion of women from the exercise of religious authority. The ordination of women in the Anglican Communion, approved for the Church of England in 1992, in the Lutheran churches of Scandinavia, and in the Reform, Conservative, and Reconstructionist movements of Judaism, represents the most significant institutional transformation in the history of 20th century religion. In the Catholic Church, the Eastern Orthodox churches, most of traditional Islam, and much of evangelical Christianity, the exclusion of women from full religious authority remains formally in place. The conversation continues, and in every tradition where it continues, it does so because women have refused to accept that their exclusion is the will of the God in whose name it is enforced. Fact 47. Religion in the modern Middle East: faith, land, and conflict. The religious dimension of the modern Middle East's conflicts cannot be understood in isolation from the political, economic, and colonial forces with which it is at every point intertwined, but neither can those forces be understood without it. Because the particular intensity of the attachment that all three Abrahamic traditions feel toward a geography of 49 square kilometers at the center of the city of Jerusalem makes this the one place on earth where the intersection of the sacred and the political reaches a degree of density that no purely secular analysis can penetrate. Jerusalem is claimed simultaneously as the holiest city on earth by Judaism, the site of the Temple Mount, where the Temple of Solomon stood and where the Western Wall, the last remnant of the Second Temple's retaining wall, remains the most sacred site in the world at which Jewish prayer is offered, as the site of the crucifixion, burial, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, making it the spiritual center of a Christian tradition numbering 2.4 billion people. And as the third holiest city in Islam, the site of the Al-Aqsa Mosque and the Dome of the Rock, from which the Prophet Muhammad is understood to have ascended to heaven on the night journey, described in the 17th chapter of the Quran. This convergence of the sacred upon a single city is without parallel in the history of religion, and it is the reason why the question of Jerusalem's political and religious status remains the single most intractable problem in contemporary international politics, one that has resisted resolution, not because the negotiators have lacked skill or goodwill, but because the claims at stake are not political in the ordinary sense but theological. Rooted in understandings of divine promise and sacred obligation that political compromise cannot simply override, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict did not begin as a religious war. Its origins lie in the encounter of secular Zionist nationalism with Arab nationalism in the late 19th century, both of them movements whose founders were largely secular in their personal commitments. But the religious dimensions of the conflict have grown steadily more prominent since the Israeli occupation of the West Bank and Gaza in 1967. The settler movement drawing on the biblical concept of the Promised Land and Hamas drawing on the Islamic concept of Waqf, territory once held by Muslims and therefore inalienable, to construct religious frameworks that foreclose the political compromises that secular nationalism might otherwise accommodate. Fact 48. The Dalai Lama and Buddhism in the modern world. The 14th Dalai Lama, Tenzin Gyatso, born in 1935 in the Tibetan province of Amdo, recognized at the age of 2 as the reincarnation of his predecessor through the traditional process of signs and tests by which the Tibetan Buddhist tradition has identified its tulkus for centuries, enthroned at the age of 4, and compelled to flee into the exile in Dharamsala, northern India. That has lasted since the Chinese military suppression of the Tibetan uprising of March 1959, has become the most widely recognized and globally influential individual religious leader of the late 20th and early 21st century. Achieving a moral authority and a cultural presence across the full range of the world's societies that no other religious figure of his era has matched, and that has been built not on institutional power. The Tibetan government in exile commands no army and no territory, but on the combination of deep Buddhist learning, extraordinary personal warmth and humor, and the moral authority of the non-violent advocacy for a people under occupation that he has sustained without bitterness or retreat through more than 6 decades of exile. The Tibetan Buddhist tradition he embodies, the Vajrayana, whose elaborate system of tantric practices, visualization meditations, deity yoga, and the institution of the recognized reincarnation creates the most philosophically and richly complex of the Buddhist traditions, has achieved, in the decades since the Tibetan diaspora scattered its teachers across the world, a global cultural influence far exceeding what its geographic origins would have predicted. The Tibetan Buddhist centers established across Europe and North America have been the primary vehicle through which the contemplative practices of Buddhism, meditation, mindfulness, the systematic cultivation of compassion, have entered the mainstream of Western psychological and medical thinking. The Dalai Lama has invested sustained personal energy in the dialogue between Buddhist contemplative science and modern neuroscience, hosting the Mind and Life Institute conferences that have brought Buddhist meditators and Western scientists together in a conversation whose findings, including the measurable neurological effects of long-term meditation practice, documented in the brains of the experienced meditators who participated in these studies, have influenced the way the Western medical community thinks about the relationship between the mind and the brain, between contemplative practice and measurable human well-being. Fact 49. The Interfaith Movement, Religions in Dialogue. The interfaith movement, the organized, institutionalized effort to bring representatives of the world's different religious traditions into structured dialogue for the purposes of mutual understanding, the reduction of religiously motivated prejudice and violence, and the discovery of the common ground that different traditions share without collapsing the real differences that distinguish them, is a distinctly modern phenomenon whose institutional origins are usually located in the world's Parliament of Religions, held in Chicago in 1893. Convened alongside the world's Columbian Exposition and representing, for the first time in the history of humanity, a gathering of leaders from the major religious traditions of the world, assembled in the same space for the explicit purpose of speaking to and with one another rather than past one another. Two figures made that parliament historically consequential in ways that its organizers could not have fully anticipated. The Swami Vivekananda, young, articulate, robed in saffron and turbaned in red, addressing an audience that had come prepared to receive the testimony of exotic curiosities from the heathen world, delivered an address on behalf of Hinduism that electrified the hall and won a sustained standing ovation. His vision of the universal spiritual truth that finds different expression in different traditions challenging the assumption, held with comfortable confidence by most of his audience, that the Christian tradition possessed a monopoly on religious insight. The Buddhist scholar Anagarika Dharmapala gave the Western audience its first sustained encounter with an articulate and entirely self-confident non-Christian voice that not only presented a positive case for its own tradition, but directly challenged the claims and the methods of the Christian missionary enterprise in Buddhist Asia. The contemporary interfaith movement encompasses a wide range of institutions and initiatives. The United Religions Initiative, the Parliament of the World's Religions, which reconvened in 1993 for its centenary and has met regularly since, and the countless local interfaith councils whose conversations in schools, hospitals, prisons, and community centers constitute the grassroots dimension of what the formal institutions represent at the level of global symbolism. Its critics argue that genuine dialogue requires the willingness to affirm that some things are true and others false, and that the movement's emphasis on commonality too easily dissolves into a vague spiritual universalism that is ultimately faithful to none of the specific traditions it claims to represent. Its defenders respond that the alternative to dialogue, in a world of nuclear weapons and deep religious diversity, is a set of consequences too serious to risk in defense of theological purity. Fact 50. Religion at 50. 50 facts into the history of religion, the exact midpoint of a journey that began in the darkness of the prehistoric cave and has arrived here, in the contested and luminous landscape of the contemporary world, where the oldest questions are being asked in the newest languages, by the newest mouths, in circumstances that would have been unrecognizable to the questioners who came before. We have watched Catholicism open its windows to the modern world and heard liberation theologians insist that those windows must face the poor. We have stood at the encounter between Darwin's account of life and the religious understanding of creation, and recognized that the conflict, where it is real, is genuinely difficult, and where it is staged, serves purposes that have little to do with either science or theology. We have followed the rise of secularism and discovered that religion is not disappearing but migrating, contracting in some places, expanding in others with an energy that secular accounts of modernity consistently fail to predict. We have sat with the hardest facts: the Holocaust, the long exclusion of women from religious authority, the entanglement of faith with political violence in a city that three traditions call the holiest on earth. We have also sat with the quieter facts: the Dalai Lama speaking of compassion from exile, the interfaith movement attempting to build understanding across centuries of suspicion, the liberation theologians insisting that the gospel belongs to the poor before it belongs to anyone else. What 50 Facts teaches is that religion cannot be summarized, cannot be judged from a single angle, cannot be celebrated without interrogation or condemned without understanding. It is too large, too old, and too deeply woven into what human beings are. 50 facts remain. The second half of the story begins now. Rest in the quiet. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 51. The Reformation of Judaism, Orthodox, Reform, and the Modern Divide. The encounter of European Jewry with the Enlightenment and the emancipation movements of the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the gradual removal of the legal restrictions that had confined Jews to ghettos, excluded them from universities and professions, and denied them the civil rights enjoyed by their Christian neighbors, created the most consequential internal crisis in the history of Judaism, since the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE. Forcing a confrontation with the question that no Jewish community in the pre-modern world had needed to answer in quite the same terms. What does it mean to be Jewish in a society that no longer requires you to be only Jewish, that offers the seductions of full civic participation in exchange for the willingness to treat Judaism as a private matter rather than a total way of life? The Reform movement that emerged in the German Jewish communities of the early 19th century answered this question by distinguishing between the eternal moral and spiritual core of the Jewish tradition and the historical accretions of law and custom that were the product of a particular time and circumstance rather than the essence of Judaism itself, conducting worship in German rather than Hebrew. Abandoning the traditional prayer for the restoration of the temple and the return to the land of Israel, and reformulating Jewish identity in terms of a universal ethical monotheism, whose demands were compatible with full participation in modern civic life. The Orthodox response, the term itself coined in reaction to the Reform, insisted that the Torah in its entirety, written and oral, was the direct word of God, and that any accommodation to modernity that involved the modification of the law was not reform but apostasy. Between these positions, the conservative movement that developed in the United States in the late 19th century sought to maintain the authority of the Jewish legal tradition while acknowledging the historical development of that tradition and permitting a more measured engagement with modern scholarship and modern life. These three movements, and the Reconstructionist and Renewal movements that followed in the 20th century, define the landscape of contemporary Judaism, a tradition that has responded to the challenges of modernity not with a single voice, but with a sustained and unresolved conversation about the nature of its own identity. Fact 52: the Dead Sea Scrolls, when ancient texts rewrote history. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls, found between 1947 and 1956, in 11 caves along the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea near the ancient site of Qumran, by a Bedouin shepherd who threw a stone into a cave and heard the sound of breaking pottery, and who found inside not treasure in the conventional sense, but something far more consequential. Cylindrical jars containing leather and papyrus scrolls wrapped in linen, written in Hebrew and Aramaic, and dating to the period between the 3rd century BCE and the 1st century CE, constitutes the most significant archaeological discovery in the history of biblical scholarship, and one of the most consequential finds in the entire history of religion. The collection of approximately 900 manuscripts includes the oldest surviving copies of the Hebrew Bible by approximately 1,000 years, copies whose comparison with the texts that had previously been the oldest available demonstrated, to the relief of textual scholars and the surprise of the general public, a degree of accuracy in the transmission of the biblical text over those 1,000 years that was nothing less than remarkable. The scrolls also include a body of texts, rule books, hymns, apocalyptic visions, biblical commentaries, and a remarkable document called the War Scroll describing an eschatological battle between the sons of light and the sons of darkness, that appear to represent the literature of a Jewish sect, most likely the Essenes, living in a deliberately separated community at Qumran whose particular theological preoccupations, the cosmic dualism of light and darkness, the expectation of an imminent divine intervention in history, the concept of a new covenant between God and a purified remnant of Israel, illuminate the Jewish religious world from which both Christianity and Rabbinic Judaism emerged, and cast new light on the intellectual and spiritual environment in which the earliest followers of Jesus understood their experience. The scrolls remind us that the religious traditions we inherit did not spring fully formed from a single moment of revelation, but emerged from a world of intense religious diversity and debate whose full complexity the subsequent canonical tradition only partially preserved. Fact 53: Sacred music, the sound of the holy. Music occupies a place in the history of religion that no other art form can claim, not because it is universally present in religious practice, though it very nearly is, but because of the particular relationship between music and the dimensions of human experience that religion seeks to address. Sound moves through the body as well as the mind. It creates states of consciousness that the rational faculty neither generates nor controls. It binds communities together in the shared resonance of simultaneous experience in ways that spoken language, addressed from one person to others, cannot replicate. The specific forms that sacred music has taken across the world's religious traditions reveal, in their differences, something of what each tradition understands the sacred encounter to require. The Gregorian chant of the medieval Catholic Church, developed from the earlier plain chant traditions, and systematized under the influence attributed to Pope Gregory I in the 6th century, its single unaccompanied melodic line moving through the acoustic space of the stone cathedral, in a way designed to lift the mind from the ordinary toward the contemplative, embodies a theology of transcendence, of the human voice reaching upward toward a reality beyond itself. The call to prayer of the Islamic muezzin, the adhan, sounded 5 times daily from the minaret, its particular melodic contours the vehicle of the most fundamental statement of Islamic faith, embodies a theology of presence and interruption, the sacred breaking into the ordinary not at the worshipper's initiative, but at God's command. The ecstatic drumming and singing of West African religious traditions, carried across the Atlantic in the bodies of enslaved people, and surviving in the transformed but recognizable forms of the Afro-Brazilian, Afro-Cuban, and Haitian religious traditions, embodies a theology of possession and surrender, the divine entering the human community not as an object of contemplation, but as a living presence that takes hold of the body itself. The Hindu devotional music of the bhajans and kirtan, the Jewish cantorial tradition, the Protestant hymns of Bach and Wesley, the Sufi psalmer of whirling and song, each represents a different answer to the same question. What does the sacred sound like, and how do we make music that carries us toward it? Fact 54. Pilgrimage, the journey as prayer. Pilgrimage, the practice of undertaking a journey, often arduous, to a place understood as sacred, as the dwelling of a divine presence, or as the site of a sacred event, and of arriving at that place in a state of spiritual transformation produced by the journey itself as much as by the destination, is among the most universal practices in the history of religion, present in some form in virtually every major religious tradition in the world and representing. In its particular combination of physical effort, geographic displacement, and communal solidarity, one of the most direct expressions of the human conviction that the ordinary world is not uniformly inhabited by the sacred, that there are places where the boundary between the human and the divine is thinner than elsewhere, and that the willingness to leave the comfort of the familiar and to walk toward the holy constitutes, in itself, an act of faith. The Hajj, the annual pilgrimage to Mecca required of every Muslim physically and financially capable of undertaking it, at least once in a lifetime, drawing each year between 2 and 3 million pilgrims from every country in the world to perform, in a sequence of rituals whose particular forms replicate the actions of Abraham and his family at the dawn of the Abrahamic tradition, is the largest annual gathering of human beings for any purpose on earth. Its extraordinary scale, a visible expression of the Islamic understanding of the unity of the global Muslim community, the Ummah, whose diversity of language, culture, race, and nationality is dissolved in the shared white garments of the ihram and the shared performance of the tawaf, the circumambulation of the Kaaba at the center of the Grand Mosque. The Christian pilgrimage to Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, where the bones of the Apostle James are said to be buried, and which drew hundreds of thousands of medieval pilgrims along the routes that became the Camino de Santiago, has undergone a remarkable revival in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, attracting not only devout Catholics but secular walkers drawn to the particular quality of the journey. Weeks on foot across the mountains and plains of northern Spain, stripped of the usual comforts and distractions of modern life, arriving at the great cathedral in a state of physical exhaustion and, very often, unexpected emotional clarity. The journey, it seems, does something to the traveler that the destination alone cannot. Fact 55. The Black Church, Faith as Survival and Liberation. The African-American religious tradition, the particular complex of churches, theologies, practices, and moral commitments that emerged from the experience of enslaved Africans in the American South, developed through the century of legally enforced racial segregation that followed emancipation, and produced in the 20th century the civil rights movement whose particular achievement, the dismantling of the legal apparatus of American apartheid, constitutes the most consequential social transformation in the history of American democracy, is among the most distinctive and the most historically significant religious traditions to emerge on American soil, its particular character shaped by the encounter between the Christianity of the slaveholders, the surviving African religious sensibilities of the enslaved, and the specific moral demands of a situation in which faith was simultaneously the instrument of oppression and the primary resource of survival. The enslaved people who were brought to Christianity by their masters took from the tradition not the theology of submission that their masters intended to convey, that God had ordained their bondage, and that obedience was their Christian duty, but the theology of liberation that the same tradition contained, and that the masters could not excise without destroying the Christianity they were offering. The God who had heard the cry of the enslaved Israelites in Egypt and sent Moses to set them free, who had declared that the last would be first and the first last, who had identified himself with the hungry, the naked, and the imprisoned. The invisible institution, the secret worship services held in the woods and the cabins, beyond the sight of the masters, in which the enslaved community could encounter God on their own terms, became, after emancipation, the Black Church. The central institution of African American community life, the primary site of education, mutual aid, political organization, and the cultivation of the dignity that the surrounding society denied. From this tradition emerged the specific moral vocabulary and the specific organizational capacity of the civil rights movement. The mass meetings in the churches, the freedom songs whose particular combination of sacred music and political urgency carried the movement through its darkest hours, and the theology of redemptive suffering articulated by Martin Luther King Jr., who understood the willingness of the movement's participants to absorb violence without retaliation as a specific form of the love that the gospel demands. Fact 56. Religion and death, how traditions face the end. Death is the fact around which every religious tradition in human history has organized itself most urgently. The datum of human experience so absolute, so universal, and so resistant to the consolations of ordinary thought that it has served, in every culture and every century, as the primary driver of the religious imagination and the primary test of the religious vision. The extraordinary diversity of the ways in which the world's religious traditions have understood what death is, what follows it, and what obligations the living owe to the dead reveals, in compressed form, the full range of the human capacity for metaphysical creativity in the face of the one experience that every human being shares. The ancient Egyptian tradition, which invested more cultural energy in the preparation for death and the maintenance of the dead than any other civilization in history, constructing the pyramids at enormous collective cost to preserve the bodies of the pharaohs through whose continued existence in the afterlife the cosmic order was maintained, understood death not as an ending, but as a transition requiring the most careful technical and ritual management. The preservation of the body through mummification, the provision of the spells and prayers of the Book of the Dead to navigate the dangers of the underworld, and the final judgment of the soul in the Hall of Two Truths. The Buddhist tradition understands death as one moment in a continuous cycle of rebirth, samsara, driven by the karmic consequences of past actions and the attachments of desire and aversion, a cycle that continues until the attainment of nirvana, the extinguishing of those attachments and the liberation from the cycle itself. The Abrahamic traditions share a broad framework of individual judgment after death and the ultimate resurrection of the body at the end of history, though the specific content of each tradition's vision of what follows death is considerably more varied than this shared framework suggests. What unites these visions across their differences is the refusal to accept that the death of a person is the simple end of that person, a refusal that may itself tell us something essential about the nature of consciousness and its relationship to the physical processes that temporarily house it. Fact 57. Prosperity Gospel, when God promises wealth. The prosperity gospel, the particular theological movement that emerged within American Pentecostalism in the mid-20th century, and has since become one of the most globally influential and most theologically controversial forms of Christianity in the contemporary world, teaching that financial wealth and physical health are the will of God for all believers, and that faith, positive confession, and generous giving to the ministry will reliably produce material abundance. Represents the most radical accommodation of the Christian message to the values of consumer capitalism in the history of American religion, and the most consequential theological export of American religious culture to the developing world, where its message of divine prosperity has resonated with extraordinary force among the poor populations of sub-Saharan Africa, Latin America, and Southeast Asia who have embraced it in numbers that dwarf its American following. The theological foundation of the prosperity gospel rests on a reading of the Hebrew Bible's covenant promises, the specific passages in Deuteronomy and elsewhere in which God promises material blessing to Israel in return for covenant faithfulness, and on the New Testament letters of Paul, interpreted as teaching that the poverty of Christ on the cross was an economic transaction through which Christ took on human poverty so that believers could receive divine wealth. Its critics within the Christian tradition, who are numerous and include theologians across the full spectrum from Catholic to evangelical Protestant, argue that this reading inverts the actual theology of both testaments, replacing the God who identifies with the poor and calls the rich to account with a divine vending machine that rewards the faith of the wealthy and implicitly blames the poor for their own poverty. The figures who built the prosperity gospel into a global phenomenon, Oral Roberts, Kenneth Hagin, Kenneth Copeland, Joel Osteen, and their international equivalents, have accumulated personal fortunes and built institutions whose scale reflects the extraordinary commercial as well as spiritual appeal of a message that tells its hearers that God wants them to be rich. Fact 58. Religion and art, the sacred and the beautiful. The relationship between religious conviction and artistic creation is among the most productive and most complex in the entire history of human culture. Productive because the intensity of the religious impulse, the desire to make the invisible visible, and to give the sacred a form that the senses can encounter, has driven some of the most extraordinary artistic achievements in every medium that human beings have employed. Complex because the same religious traditions that commissioned the Sistine Chapel ceiling and the Cathedral of Chartres have also, at different moments in their histories, destroyed images, banned music, and condemned artistic beauty as a distraction from the spiritual life. The tension between the ikonophile and the iconoclast, between those who understand the beautiful image as a window through which the divine can be glimpsed, and those who understand it as an idol that substitutes the human creation for the divine reality, runs through the history of virtually every major religious tradition. The Byzantine iconoclasm of the 8th and 9th centuries, in which the emperors Leo III and Constantine V ordered the destruction of the icons that had become central to Eastern Christian devotion and were challenged by the monk John of Damascus, who developed the first systematic theology of the religious image, the Protestant Reformation's whitewashing of the painted walls and smashing of the stained glass of the medieval churches, and the Taliban's demolition in 2000, one of the 6th century Bamiyan Buddhas, the largest standing Buddha figures in the world, are all expressions of the same theological anxiety, that the image can capture what it is supposed to point beyond, that the beauty of the thing made can become more compelling than the reality it was made to represent. Against this anxiety stands the equally persistent conviction that the beautiful is not the enemy of the sacred, but its ally, that the light pouring through the rose window at Chartres, the calligraphy of the Quran inscribed in gold on the walls of the Alhambra, and the sound of Bach's St. Matthew Passion are not distractions from the divine, but among its most authentic earthly expressions. Fact 59. Religion and food, the sacred table. Food, the most universal of human necessities and the most socially charged of human practices, has occupied a central place in the ritual life of virtually every religious tradition in the history of humanity. Its particular significance in the religious context deriving from its unique capacity to serve simultaneously as the most basic expression of human biological dependence and the most direct vehicle of communal identity, sacred memory, and the encounter with the divine. The dietary laws that structure the eating practices of observant Jews, the kashrut, whose elaborate system of permitted and forbidden foods, of the separation of meat and dairy, and of the careful preparation of permitted meats through ritual slaughter, reflects a theological vision in which the ordinary act of eating is transformed into an act of sanctification, a constant reminder of the covenant between God and the Jewish people enacted at every meal. Are among the most consequential and most identity-forming practices in the entire Jewish tradition, their observance marking the boundary between the Jewish community and the surrounding world in the most intimate possible register, the regulation of what enters the body. The Islamic halal laws share the same structure of permitted and forbidden foods, and the same requirement of ritual slaughter, functioning similarly as a constant marker of Muslim identity in a non-Muslim world. The Christian tradition, by contrast, largely abandoned dietary law in the earliest decades of the Church. The vision received by the Apostle Peter in the Acts of the Apostles, in which a sheet descends from heaven bearing all manner of animals, and a voice declares them clean, was understood as the theological foundation for the inclusion of Gentiles in the Christian community, without the requirement of observing the Jewish law. Though the Lenten fasting traditions and the particular significance of the Eucharist, in which bread and wine are understood in the Catholic tradition to become literally the body and blood of Christ, preserve the sense of food as the vehicle of the sacred encounter in a form whose particular intimacy, the divine received into the body, has no parallel in any other religious tradition. Fact 60. Religion at 60. 60 facts into the history of religion, and the story has grown intimate, closer to the texture of lived experience, to the everyday practices through which billions of people have enacted their relationship with the sacred across the full span of human history. We have followed the internal fractures of Judaism as it encountered modernity, and recognized in those fractures not weakness, but the vitality of a tradition willing to argue about its own identity across centuries without resolving into silence. We have unrolled the Dead Sea Scrolls in our imagination, and understood that the traditions we inherit emerged from a world of greater complexity and greater diversity than their canonical forms suggest. We have listened to the chant of the cathedral, the adhan from the minaret, the drumming of the African religious ceremony, and understood that music is not an ornament of religious life, but one of its primary languages. We have walked the Camino, circled the Kaaba, and sat with the question of what a journey does to the traveler that arrival alone cannot. We have sat with the Black Church, that extraordinary institution born in the crucible of slavery and forged into the instrument of liberation, and understood that the history of religion is not only the history of what the powerful have done with faith, but what the powerless have done with it. We have faced death in 7 traditions, and found that the refusal to accept annihilation is not wishful thinking, but one of the deepest and most consistent facts about what it means to be human. 40 facts remain. The story moves now toward the contemporary world, toward the questions that our own moment is asking of religion and the answers that religion is giving back. Rest in the quiet of what you have heard. This is Explore During Sleeping. Fact 61. Religion and the state when faith holds power. The relationship between religious authority and political power is among the oldest and most consequential problems in the history of civilization. A problem that has never been finally resolved, and that takes a new form in every generation, because the claims of religious authority and the claims of political authority both address the deepest questions of human community. How people should live, what they owe one another, what obligations bind the individual to the group, and on whose authority those obligations are enforced. The range of historical arrangements through which different civilizations have managed this relationship is extraordinarily wide. At one end stands the theocracy, the political order in which religious authority and political authority are held by the same institution or the same person, in which the law of God and the law of the state are understood as identical, and in which the enforcement of religious conformity is a function of the state apparatus. The theocratic ideal has animated religious civilizations as different as the Islamic caliphate of the first centuries of Islamic history, in which the caliph was understood as both political ruler and guardian of the religious community. The Calvinist Geneva of the 16th century, in which John Calvin sought to organize an entire city according to the moral demands of the gospel as he understood them. And the papal states of medieval and early modern Europe, in which the Bishop of Rome exercised temporal sovereignty over a significant portion of central Italy, while simultaneously claiming spiritual authority over the entire Christian world. At the other end stands the secular state, the political order in which religious authority and political authority are formally separated, in which the state claims no religious identity and enforces no religious conformity, and in which the freedom of religious conscience is protected as a fundamental civil right. This arrangement, whose philosophical foundations were laid by the Enlightenment, and whose institutional form was pioneered by the American Constitution's First Amendment prohibition of any law respecting an establishment of religion, has become the dominant model of political organization in the contemporary developed world, though its relationship with the religious communities it governs remains a source of continuous tension, as questions about the place of religious symbols in public space. The rights of religious communities to govern their own internal affairs and the limits of religious exemptions from generally applicable law demonstrate in every democratic society where they arise. Fact 62. The printing press and the Bible, technology changes religion. The invention of the movable type printing press by Johannes Gutenberg in the German city of Mainz in approximately 1440 was the most consequential single technological development in the history of religion, more consequential in its effects on the specific transmission, interpretation, and authority of religious knowledge than any other invention before the Internet, and more immediately transformative in its impact on the religious landscape of its own era than any political or military event of the 15th century. The first major book that Gutenberg printed was the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible of approximately 1455, produced in an edition of around 180 copies, each one representing in its physical beauty and its comparative affordability a revolution in the relationship between the written word of God and the people to whom that word was addressed. Before the printing press, the reproduction of texts was a manual process requiring months of skilled labor, and the result was a manuscript whose cost placed it beyond the reach of any but the wealthiest institutions and individuals. The Bible was, for the overwhelming majority of medieval Christians, not a book they could read but a text mediated to them through the authority of the church, through the sermon, the liturgy, and the visual theology of the stained glass and the sculpted portal. The printing press changed this relationship with a speed that the religious and political authorities of the time were entirely unprepared for. Martin Luther's 95 Theses of 1517, a document that in an earlier era might have circulated among a handful of scholars before being quietly suppressed, were printed and distributed across the German lands within weeks, reaching audiences that no previous theological controversy had reached. Luther's translation of the New Testament into German, completed in 1522, sold 5,000 copies in 2 weeks, and placed the text of Scripture directly in the hands of German readers who could judge its meaning for themselves, without the mediation of a church whose authority Luther was simultaneously challenging. The printing press did not cause the Reformation, but it gave the Reformation the velocity without which it could not have escaped the fate of the many earlier reform movements that the institutional church had managed to contain and absorb. Fact 63. The Inquisition when the church used fear. The Inquisition, the particular institution of ecclesiastical investigation and judgment, established by the Catholic Church in the 13th century to identify, try, and if necessary punish those whose religious beliefs deviated from the teaching of the Church, is among the most examined and the most misrepresented chapters in the history of Western Christianity, its popular image, shaped by centuries of Protestant polemics and Gothic horror. Considerably more lurid than the historical record supports while remaining, at its accurate core, a genuine and serious moral failure of an institution claiming to represent the God who is love. The medieval Inquisition was established in response to the rapid spread of the Cathar movement in southern France, a dualist religious tradition that rejected the material world as the creation of an evil principle, condemned marriage and the eating of meat, and attracted a substantial following among the nobility and the common people of Languedoc by the early 13th century. Pope Gregory IX formalized the inquisitorial process in 1231, appointing the Dominican friars, whose particular combination of theological training and mendicant simplicity seemed to fit them for the task, as the primary agents of the investigation. The Spanish Inquisition, established by Ferdinand and Isabella in 1478, and operating under royal rather than papal authority, was primarily directed at the conversos, Jews and Muslims, who had converted to Christianity under social and legal pressure, and were suspected of continuing to practice their original religions in secret, and was considerably more severe in its use of torture and execution than the medieval Inquisition it succeeded. The historical record, as reconstructed by modern scholars with access to the Inquisition's own archives, reveals an institution that was in many respects more procedurally careful than the secular courts of the same period, that executed a far smaller number of people than the popular imagination supposes. And that was motivated as much by the genuine theological conviction that heresy endangered the souls of the faithful, as by the appetite for power and cruelty that the popular narrative attributes to it. None of this erases the moral gravity of an institution that used the threat of violence to enforce religious conformity. It only insists that the moral reckoning be grounded in the actual history. Fact 64. Martyrdom, dying for the faith. Martyrdom, the willingness to accept death rather than renounce the religious faith to which one is committed, and the transformation of that death by the religious community into a testimony whose particular power to inspire, to consolidate community identity, and to legitimate the tradition it represents has made it one of the most consequential acts in the history of religion, is present in virtually every major religious tradition. Its moral logic both deeply admirable in its expression of the absolute priority of conscience over physical survival, and deeply troubling in its susceptibility to the manipulation of the powerful, who have often found in the martyr's willingness to die a resource for mobilizing communities to sacrifice themselves in causes whose relationship to the genuine demands of conscience is rather more ambiguous than the theology of martyrdom acknowledges. The earliest Christian martyrs, those executed in the Roman arena and the Roman prison during the sporadic persecutions of the first 3 centuries of the Church, before the conversion of Constantine made Christianity the favored religion of the empire, created, through their deaths, the theological and spiritual framework through which the entire subsequent history of Christian martyrdom has been understood. The conviction that death for the faith is participation in the death of Christ, that the blood of the martyr is, as Tertullian wrote, the seed of the Church, that the willingness to die rather than burn incense before the image of the emperor is the ultimate testimony to the reality of the God in whose name the refusal is made. The Islamic tradition of Shahada, the Arabic word for martyr sharing its root with the word for testimony or witness, carries the same conviction that death in the path of God is a form of the ultimate religious act, though the distinction between the martyr who accepts death rather than renounce the faith and the suicide bomber who deliberately seeks death while killing others is a distinction that the most careful Islamic scholars have insisted upon with increasing urgency in the contemporary period. Martyrdom at its most authentic is not the desire for death, but the refusal to purchase life at the price of what one understands to be the truth. Fact 65. Wahhabism and Salafism, Islam's internal revolution. The religious reform movement, founded in the Central Arabian Peninsula in the mid-18th century by the scholar Muhammad ibn Abd al-Wahhab, who formed a political alliance with the tribal leader Muhammad ibn Saud in 1744 that created the religious political compact on which the modern Saudi state is built, represents the most consequential internal religious development in the history of modern Islam. Its particular vision of an Islam purified of the accretions of popular devotion, Sufi mysticism, and the veneration of saints and shrines that Abd al-Wahhab condemned as innovations incompatible with the pure monotheism of the Quran, and the Sunnah generating a reform program whose influence, carried by the extraordinary wealth of the Saudi oil state after 1973 into Muslim communities across the world through the funding of mosques, madrasas, and religious literature, has transformed the religious landscape of Islam more profoundly than any other single force of the 20th century. The terms Wahhabism and Salafism, the latter derived from the Arabic word for the pious ancestors, Salaf, of the early Muslim community, whose practice is taken as the normative standard against which contemporary Islamic life is to be measured, are used differently by different scholars and differently by the movements themselves, but they share the core conviction that the Islam of the first generation of Muslims represents the authentic and uncorrupted form of the faith, and that the subsequent centuries of theological development, legal elaboration, and devotional practice represent a departure from that purity that must be reversed. The political consequences of this movement have been profound and deeply ambiguous. The same theological framework that produced the austere but non-violent religious conservatism of official Saudi Islam also provided the religious vocabulary of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, whose interpretation of the Salafi tradition, emphatically rejected by the majority of Salafi scholars, authorized the violence that has defined the encounter between political Islam and the rest of the world in the early 21st century. Fact 66. Religion and healing, faith, medicine, and the body. The relationship between religious practice and physical healing is among the oldest in the history of religion, predating the distinction between medicine and religion that the modern world takes for granted and persisting in forms both ancient and novel into the present moment, in which the relationship between contemplative practice, psychological well-being, and physical health has become one of the most actively researched areas in the interface between the religious and the scientific understanding of the human person. In virtually every pre-modern culture, the figure responsible for the diagnosis and treatment of illness was also the figure responsible for the maintenance of the community's relationship with the sacred. The shaman whose journey to the spirit world was simultaneously a diagnostic and a therapeutic act. The priest whose ritual intercession on behalf of the sick was understood as effective in the most direct and practical sense. The healer whose knowledge of medicinal plants was inseparable from the ritual framework within which those plants were gathered, prepared, and administered. The great medical traditions of the ancient world, the Ayurvedic medicine of India, the traditional Chinese medicine of the Yellow Emperor's Classic, the Hippocratic medicine of ancient Greece, all developed within religious or philosophical frameworks that understood the health of the body as inseparable from the health of the soul and from the relationship of both to the larger order of the cosmos. The Christian tradition produced both the hospital, the first institutions dedicated exclusively to the care of the sick, established in the Byzantine Empire in the 4th century under the inspiration of the Christian conviction that care for the suffering body was a form of the service rendered to Christ himself, and the theological framework within which miraculous healing was understood as a sign of the kingdom of God breaking into the present order. The contemporary research on meditation, prayer, and health, however contested its specific findings, reflects the persistent intuition that the religious dimensions of human experience are not irrelevant to the biological processes through which we live and die. Fact 67. Religion and the environment, faith meets the ecological crisis. The encounter between the world's religious traditions and the ecological crisis of the late 20th and early 21st centuries, the particular set of environmental challenges, led by climate change and biodiversity loss, whose scale and whose urgency have forced every major human institution to examine its relationship to the natural world, has produced one of the most significant theological developments in the contemporary history of religion. As traditions that had historically focused their concern on the relationship between human beings and the divine, or between human beings and one another, have been compelled by the facts of environmental destruction to articulate, often for the first time in systematic terms, a theology of the natural world and of the human obligations toward it. The particular challenge that the ecological crisis poses to the Abrahamic traditions is shaped by the influential and disputed argument advanced by the historian Lynn White Jr. in a 1967 essay in Science, in which he proposed that the Christian tradition's reading of the Genesis mandate to have dominion over the earth had provided the theological justification for the exploitative relationship to nature that produced the environmental crisis, making Christianity, in White's formulation, the most anthropocentric religion the world had seen, and therefore bearing a significant share of the responsibility for the ecological consequences of that anthropocentrism. The theological responses to White's argument have been varied and productive. Biblical scholars have argued that the Genesis mandate is better understood as a call to stewardship than to exploitation, that the same texts White cited also command the Sabbath rest of the land and the care of the creation, whose beauty the Psalms celebrate with sustained lyrical intensity. The Buddhist and Hindu traditions, whose cosmologies embed the human being in a web of interdependence with all living things rather than placing it above them, have found in their own philosophical resources a more immediately available ecological theology, though the gap between theological principle and the actual environmental practices of Buddhist and Hindu societies has proven, as it has in the Christian world, considerably wider than the theology alone would suggest. Fact 68. New Atheism, when unbelief becomes a movement. The new atheism, the particular intellectual and cultural phenomenon that emerged in the English-speaking world in the mid-2000s, associated primarily with the biologist Richard Dawkins, the philosopher Daniel Dennett, the journalist Christopher Hitchens, and the neuroscientist Sam Harris, and distinguished from earlier forms of atheism by its particular combination of intellectual confidence, rhetorical aggression, and missionary zeal, whose explicit purpose was not merely the personal rejection of religious belief, but the active persuasion of the religious public that their beliefs were false, harmful, and deserving of the kind of critical scrutiny from which they had for too long been protected by a cultural deference that the new atheists found incomprehensible. Represents the most publicly visible expression of the secular challenge to religion in the early 21st century, and a phenomenon whose cultural significance is considerably greater than the actual number of people it persuaded to change their minds. Dawkins' The God Delusion, published in 2006, sold more than 3 million copies and catalyzed a public conversation about the rationality of religious belief that had previously been conducted primarily in academic philosophy and theology, but now entered the mainstream of popular culture. The theological critiques of new atheism, offered by religious philosophers and theologians who found its understanding of the God it was arguing against a caricature of the sophisticated theological positions developed in the major traditions over centuries, were largely correct in their diagnosis. The God that Dawkins and Hitchens argued against was indeed a much simpler and much cruder conception than the God of Aquinas or Maimonides or Al-Ghazali, and the scientific arguments they marshaled against the existence of a divine creator were, in the view of philosophers like Alvin Plantinga and John Polkinghorne, arguments against a theological position that few serious theologians actually held. What the new atheists captured accurately, and what accounts for the cultural resonance of their work, was the moral seriousness of the objections to the historical record of organized religion, the genuine intellectual difficulty of believing in a good and powerful God in a world of the suffering they documented with considerable force. Fact 69. Religion and Forgiveness, the Theology of Second Chances. Forgiveness, the particular moral and spiritual act in which the one who has been wronged releases the wrongdoer from the debt that the wrong has created, not on the basis of the wrongdoer's merit or the adequacy of any reparation offered, but as an act of grace that breaks the otherwise self-perpetuating cycle of injury and retaliation, is among the most distinctive and the most consequential concepts in the history of religion. Present in different forms and with different emphases across the major traditions and representing, in its theological depth and its practical difficulty, one of the clearest points at which the demands of the religious life diverge most sharply from the intuitions of ordinary human psychology. The Christian tradition places forgiveness at the theological center of its understanding of both the divine-human relationship and the human social order. The Lord's Prayer, which Jesus taught his disciples as the paradigm of prayer, places the petition for forgiveness in an explicit relationship of reciprocity with the commitment to forgive others, and the parable of the prodigal son, which most readers of the Gospels identify as the most powerful narrative illustration of the divine character in the entire New Testament, is a story about the priority of the Father's love over the Son's desert, about the grace that runs down the road to meet the returning exile before any confession has been offered or any reparation made. The Jewish tradition, whose Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the most solemn day in the Jewish liturgical year, structures the entire annual calendar around the communal and individual practice of repentance and return to God, insists with equal force on the obligation to seek forgiveness from those one has wronged before seeking it from God, on the understanding that the vertical relationship with the divine cannot be repaired, while the horizontal relationship with the neighbor remains broken. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Post-Apartheid South Africa, drawing explicitly on the theological resources of the African and Christian traditions, and presided over by Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who articulated its moral framework in explicitly theological terms, remains the most ambitious political experiment in the application of the religious concept of forgiveness to the healing of a society fractured by systematic injustice. Fact 70, Religion at 70. 70 facts into the history of religion, and the story has grown into something that no single tradition can contain, a conversation conducted across 5,000 years and every inhabited continent, returning again and again to the same irreducible questions while finding, each time, answers shaped by the particular landscape, the particular moment, the particular human community in which the question is being asked. We have watched faith hold the sword of political power, and watched the printing press carry the word of God into hands that had never touched it before. We have sat inside the Inquisition's logic, terrible, and in its own terms, coherent, and stood with the martyr who chose death over the betrayal of conscience. We have followed Wahhabism's reform impulse from the 18th century Arabian desert to the 21st century's most urgent political crises, and stood with the healer whose medicine and whose prayer were once the same act. We have heard the new atheists make their case with considerable intelligence and considerable anger, and watched the theologians respond with the sophistication of traditions whose understanding of God is rather more complex than their critics acknowledged. We have sat with forgiveness, the hardest demand that any religious tradition makes, and recognized in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission the most serious modern attempt to take that demand literally, at the level of an entire society. What 70 Facts teaches is that religion is not one thing. It is the full range of the human response to the full range of the human condition. At its best, the highest expression of what we are capable of. At its worst, the most dangerous amplifier of what we are capable of. 30 facts remain. Rest now. This is explored during sleeping. Fact 71, Sacred Texts, the word that holds a world. The sacred text, the written or orally transmitted body of material that a religious community regards as authoritative, as the vehicle of a revelation whose truth surpasses what ordinary human reason could discover on its own, and whose interpretation is the central intellectual enterprise of the tradition, is the defining institution of the literate world religions, the fixed point around which every other dimension of religious life, theology, law, ritual, ethics, community, and identity orbits, and from which it receives its orientation. The three Abrahamic traditions share the conviction that God has spoken in human language, and that the record of that speech, however the process of its transmission is understood, carries an authority that no other human document possesses, though they differ profoundly in their understanding of the nature of that authority and the methods appropriate for its interpretation. The Islamic understanding of the Quran as the literal word of God dictated to the Prophet in Arabic, making the Arabic text itself sacred in a way that no translation can replicate, and making the memorization and recitation of that text in its original language a religious act whose merit is independent of the hearer's understanding of its meaning, is the most absolute affirmation of scriptural authority in any of the Abrahamic traditions. Its consequences for the place of the Quran in Islamic legal reasoning, theological reflection, and daily devotional practice, making it the most text-centered religion in the world. The Jewish understanding of Torah, the 5 books of Moses whose written text is supplemented by the oral tradition of interpretation codified in the Mishnah and Talmud, creating a dual revelation whose particular genius is the built-in institutional mechanism for the ongoing application of the sacred text to the conditions of every subsequent historical moment, has produced the most sustained tradition of close textual interpretation in the history of religion. A tradition of argument, commentary, and counter-commentary in which the engagement with the sacred text is itself understood as a form of worship. The Hindu relationship to the Vedas, the oldest sacred texts in continuous use anywhere in the world, whose Sanskrit language is understood as the sacred language of creation itself, differs from both in treating the text less as a source of propositional doctrine than as a sonic reality whose power resides in the precise sound of its recitation, a relationship to language in which meaning and vibration are inseparable, and in which the act of chanting is itself the primary religious act. Fact 72, Religion and Science, Conflict, Dialogue, and the Space Between. The relationship between religion and science is among the most persistently misrepresented subjects in the contemporary public conversation, misrepresented in both directions, by those who treat the two as engaged in a zero-sum war in which every advance of science is a defeat for religion. and by those who treat them as entirely separate magisteria, whose particular domains never intersect and whose respective conclusions never contradict one another. The historical reality is considerably more interesting than either of these positions suggests, a relationship of genuine complexity, in which the two enterprises have at different times and in different contexts supported and challenged, inspired and constrained one another, and in which the boundary between what counts as a religious question and what counts as a scientific one has shifted with every major development in both domains. The thesis of inevitable conflict between religion and science was largely the invention of the late 19th century, systematized in the works of John William Draper and Andrew Dickson White, whose histories of the warfare between science and theology created the narrative framework through which the Galileo affair, the reception of Darwinism, and other historical episodes have been interpreted ever since, and which modern historians of science have largely demolished as a serious historical thesis, while observing that its cultural influence continues unabated. The actual history is considerably more nuanced. The medieval universities in which the foundations of Western science were laid were ecclesiastical institutions. The monks and clergy who constitute a remarkable proportion of the pioneers of early modern science, including Gregor Mendel, whose experiments with pea plants in a Moravian monastery established the foundations of modern genetics, understood their scientific work as an expression of their religious vocation rather than a challenge to it. The genuine tensions between religious and scientific authority are real in cosmology, in evolutionary biology, in the neuroscience of religious experience, but they are tensions within a relationship of considerable historical depth and mutual entanglement, not a simple war between two armies that have never shared a camp. Fact 73. Hindu reform when India modernity met the ancient faith. The encounter of Hinduism with Western modernity in the 19th century, through the particular vehicle of British colonial rule in India, which brought with it the specific intellectual challenges of Enlightenment rationalism, the moral critique of Christian missionaries, and the legal framework of a colonial state that regarded certain Hindu practices as incompatible with civilized governance, produced one of the most remarkable episodes of religious self-examination and internal reform in the history of world religion, generating a series of reforming movements and intellectual figures whose work transformed the way Hinduism understood itself and presented itself both to the Indian public and to the wider world. The foundational figure of Hindu reform was Ram Mohan Roy, born in Bengal in 1772, a scholar of Sanskrit, Arabic, Persian, Greek, and English who had studied the Quran, the Bible, and the Upanishads with equal seriousness, and who concluded that the essential truth of the Hindu tradition was the radical monotheism of the Upanishadic philosophy, and that the polytheism, idol worship, caste discrimination, and the practice of sati, the immolation of widows on their husbands' funeral pyres, that characterized popular Hinduism were not the essence of the tradition but accretions that had obscured it. Roy founded the Brahmo Samaj in 1828, the first of the Hindu reform organizations that would reshape the religious landscape of modern India, and campaigned successfully for the legal abolition of sati in 1829. Later reformers, Swami Dayananda Saraswati, whose Arya Samaj movement sought to return to the pure Vedic religion while rejecting the caste system and the authority of the Brahmin priesthood. Ramakrishna, the Bengali mystic whose direct experience of God through multiple religious traditions convinced him that all religions lead to the same ultimate reality. And Vivekananda, whose presentation of Vedanta philosophy to the West at the 1893 Parliament of Religions began the global transmission of Hindu thought. Each offered a different answer to the question of how the oldest living religious tradition should engage with the modern world without losing its soul in the encounter. Fact 74. Religion and human rights, faith as the foundation of dignity. The relationship between the world's religious traditions and the concept of universal human rights, the particular moral and legal framework whose institutional expression is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 1948, and whose philosophical foundation is the claim that every human being possesses an inherent dignity that entitles them to a set of protections and freedoms that no state can legitimately deny, is at once one of the most fruitful and one of the most contested relationships in the contemporary history of religion. The fruitful dimension is historical. The concept of universal human dignity, whose secularized expression is the language of human rights, has deep roots in the religious traditions that shaped the civilizations from which that concept emerged. The Jewish concept of Tselem Elohim, the understanding that every human being is created in the image of God, and that the dignity attaching to that image is therefore universal and inviolable, preceding and transcending every social distinction of class, nationality, or ability, is among the most powerful formulations in the history of human thought of the moral intuition that right's language seeks to codify. The Christian natural law tradition, developed from Augustine through Aquinas and into the modern period, grounded the universal obligations of justice in the divine reason that is accessible in principle to every human being through the exercise of natural reason, providing the philosophical framework within which the universal applicability of moral norms could be defended against the claims of cultural relativism. The contested dimension is equally real. Every major religious tradition contains within its own history examples of the subordination of human dignity to religious authority, of the denial of rights to those outside the community of the faithful, and of the use of divine command to override the protections that human rights law exists to guarantee. The conversation between the religious and the secular voices in the human rights community is therefore not one of simple alignment, but of ongoing, productive, and sometimes painful negotiation. Fact 75. Religion and sexuality, the contested body. The relationship between religious authority and human sexuality is among the most contested in the contemporary history of religion, the site of some of the most consequential theological debates, the most painful personal experiences, and the most significant institutional crises in virtually every major religious tradition of the early 21st century. Every major religious tradition has developed, over the course of its history, a set of norms governing sexual conduct, norms whose particular content, reflecting the social and cultural conditions in which they were formulated, has shaped the intimate lives of hundreds of millions of people across centuries and continents, and whose authority has been challenged in the contemporary period by the conjunction of the sexual revolution, the feminist movement, the gay rights movement, and the broader cultural shift toward the individual's right to define their own sexual identity that has transformed the sexual landscape of the developed world since the 1960s. The traditional sexual ethics of the Abrahamic traditions, which have generally affirmed the goods of sexuality within the context of heterosexual marriage, while condemning sexual expression outside that context, and which have maintained that the connection between sexuality and procreation is theologically significant rather than merely biological, has been challenged most publicly and most consequentially by the emergence of the gay rights movement, whose demand for the equal recognition of same-sex relationships has created the deepest division in contemporary religious life. The Anglican Communion has been brought to the brink of formal schism by disagreements between its Western churches, which have moved toward the blessing, and in some cases the solemnization of same-sex unions, and its African churches, which have maintained the traditional teaching with considerable force. The Catholic Church under Benedict XVI and Francis has maintained the traditional prohibition on same-sex sexual expression while developing a more pastoral approach to LGBTQ+ Catholics, a distinction between the acceptance of the person and the rejection of the sexual conduct that many LGBTQ+ Catholics and their families have found insufficient to the reality of their experience. Fact 76. Religion and nationalism, when faith becomes identity. The entanglement of religious identity with national identity, the particular fusion in which the boundaries of the religious community and the boundaries of the national community are understood as coextensive, in which the faith of the ancestors becomes the defining characteristic of the people, rather than a personal commitment freely made and freely maintained, is among the most consequential and most dangerous developments in the modern history of religion. Producing in the 20th and 21st centuries a series of political movements whose combination of religious passion and national grievance has generated both remarkable mobilizations of communal energy and some of the most destructive conflicts of the modern era. The phenomenon of religious nationalism is not uniquely modern. The identification of the English nation with Protestantism in the Reformation period, of the Polish nation with Catholicism in the centuries of partition, of the Serbian nation with Orthodox Christianity, and of the Irish nation with Catholicism are all pre-modern or early modern formations whose particular intensity reflects the specific historical circumstances of communities for whom religious identity was the primary available framework of collective resistance to external domination. What distinguishes the contemporary forms of religious nationalism, the Hindu nationalism of the BJP and the RSS in India, the Buddhist nationalism of the movements in Myanmar and Sri Lanka that have been implicated in violence against Muslim minorities, the Christian nationalism of the American right, and the Jewish religious nationalism of the Israeli settler movement, is the particular combination of democratic politics and mass media through which these movements mobilize support. and the particular capacity of modern state power to translate the rhetoric of religious nationalism into policies with consequences for the civil rights and physical safety of religious minorities. The challenge that religious nationalism poses to democratic pluralism is among the defining political challenges of the early 21st century. Fact 77. The Rastafari Movement, a new religion from the margins. The Rastafari movement, which emerged in the impoverished communities of Jamaica in the 1930s, drawing on the particular confluence of the African Methodist Episcopal and revivalist Christian traditions of the Caribbean, the Pan-Africanist political thought of Marcus Garvey, whose prediction that a great African king would arise, was interpreted by the movement's early adherents as a prophecy fulfilled in the coronation of Haile Selassie as Emperor of Ethiopia in 1930. And the specific social conditions of a post-colonial society in which the descendants of enslaved Africans confronted a racial hierarchy whose theological legitimation the Rastafari movement sought to invert, represents one of the most remarkable examples in modern religious history of the emergence of a new religious tradition from the specific experience of oppression and the specific resources of the religious imagination that oppression activates. The Rastafari theology, which understands Haile Selassie as the returned Christ, the fulfillment of biblical prophecy, and the divine champion of the African people, which identifies the Babylon of the Book of Revelation with the white colonial and capitalist order whose values and whose corruptions the devout Rastafari rejects, and which understands the African diaspora's exile from the continent as a spiritual and historical condition, analogous to the Babylonian captivity of the ancient Israelites, to be ended by the repatriation to Africa that the tradition calls Zion, is not a theology of resignation, but of resistance, a reading of the Bible through the eyes of the colonized that reverses the reading offered by the colonizers. The global spread of Rastafari beyond Jamaica and beyond the African diaspora, carried primarily by the music of Bob Marley, whose particular combination of musical beauty, political urgency, and spiritual depth made him the most globally influential religious artist of the 20th century, created, in the decades after his death in 1981, a worldwide community of practitioners and sympathizers whose attachment to the movement's values of peace, natural living, and resistance to oppression transcends the specifically Jamaican and specifically African roots from which those values grew. Fact 78. The spiritual but not religious, faith without institution. The emergence of the category known in the sociology of religion as the spiritual but not religious, the growing population of individuals in the contemporary developed world, particularly in the United States and Western Europe, who report a personal spiritual life, a belief in some form of transcendent reality, and a set of practices including meditation, prayer, or engagement with nature understood as spiritually significant, while simultaneously rejecting affiliation with any organized religious institution and declining to identify with any traditional religious label, represents the most significant new formation in the religious landscape of the early 21st century, and the one whose implications for the future of institutional religion are most consequential and most difficult to assess. The phenomenon is not simply the secularization thesis with a softer edge. The spiritual but not religious do not understand themselves as post-religious in the sense of having moved beyond the need for the kind of meaning, community, and encounter with transcendence that religion has historically provided. They understand themselves as having found those goods, or as seeking them, outside the institutional frameworks that the traditional religions offer. Their critique of organized religion is typically moral before it is theological. They leave not because they find the metaphysical claims of religion incredible, but because they find the institutional record of organized religion, its hierarchies of power, its exclusions, its historical complicity with structures of oppression, its capacity to become the vehicle of the narrowest rather than the broadest human solidarities, incompatible with the spiritual values they hold. The theological question that this population poses to the institutional religions is not whether God exists, but whether the institution is a necessary mediator of the encounter with God, or whether the encounter can be sustained without the institution. A question whose answer, across the history of religion, has been consistently more complicated than either the institutions or their critics have generally wished to acknowledge. Fact 79. Religion and memory, the sacred past. The relationship between religious tradition and the human capacity for collective memory, the particular way in which religious communities preserve, transmit, and continually reinterpret their understanding of the past, making the events and figures of that past present and active in the life of the contemporary community rather than merely historically remote, is among the most distinctive and most consequential features of religious life. distinguishing it from secular forms of cultural transmission in ways that have profound implications for the identity, the resilience, and the transformative capacity of religious communities across time. The Jewish Passover Seder, in which the family gathered around the table, is commanded not merely to remember the Exodus from Egypt as a historical event that happened to other people in a distant past, but to understand themselves as personally having been brought out of Egypt, the Haggadah insisting that, in every generation, each person is obligated to see themselves as if they personally left Egypt. Is the most powerful and most deliberately constructed example in the history of religion of the ritual techniques through which a community makes the past present, transforming historical memory into lived identity. The Christian Eucharist performs a structurally similar operation. The words of institutions spoken at every Mass or communion service, "Do this in remembrance of me," are not a call to historical recollection, but to a representation of the Last Supper whose particular force, in the Catholic theological tradition, lies precisely in the claim that the boundary between the past event and its ritual repetition is genuinely dissolved in the act of celebration. The power of religious communities to survive persecution, exile, and cultural dissolution, the survival of the Jewish people through 2,000 years of diaspora, the persistence of Tibetan Buddhist identity through decades of Chinese cultural suppression, is more than any other single factor, a function of the religious tradition's capacity to make the past so alive in the present that the community's identity cannot be severed from the source that sustains it. Fact 80, Religion at 80. 80 facts into the history of religion, and the story has arrived at the threshold of the present moment, the place where the long arc of religious history meets the world that you and I inhabit. We have followed the sacred text from the clay tablet to the printed page, and recognized that every major shift in the technology of communication has transformed the religious landscape as thoroughly as any theological argument. We have stood at the encounter between religion and science, and refused the simple story of inevitable conflict, finding instead a history of genuine complexity in which the two great enterprises of the human mind have circled one another with suspicion, admiration, and mutual need. We have watched Hinduism examine itself in the mirror of colonial modernity, followed the logic of human rights back to its roots in the conviction that every person is made in the image of something sacred, and sat with the deep discomfort of the conversation between religious tradition and human sexuality. We have heard the Rastafari read the Bible from the bottom of the world's hierarchies, and find in it a story of liberation that the powerful had not intended to share. We have stood with the spiritual, but not religious, and recognized in their departure from institutions not simply the abandonment of faith, but its migration toward new forms. We have sat with the Passover table and the Eucharistic altar, and understood that the religious community's relationship to its own past is not merely commemorative but constitutive, that the past is not behind it but inside it, alive in every ritual, every prayer, every story told in the dark to children who will one day tell it to their own. 20 facts remain. The story moves now toward its conclusion, not its end, because the history of religion has no end while there are human beings alive to ask the questions that religion exists to address. Rest now in the deep quiet of what you have heard. This is Explore During Sleeping. Fact 81, the Pentecostal explosion, the Holy Spirit goes global. The Pentecostal movement, which began in the specific circumstances of the Azusa Street revival in Los Angeles in 1906, when the African-American preacher William J. Seymour led a multiracial congregation in a warehouse on Azusa Street, through a sustained experience of what the participants understood as the outpouring of the Holy Spirit described in the second chapter of the Acts of the Apostles, including speaking in tongues, healing, and prophetic utterance, has achieved in the century, since its founding, the most rapid demographic expansion of any religious movement in the history of Christianity, and arguably in the history of world religion, growing from a handful of participants in a converted warehouse to an estimated 600 million adherents worldwide by the early 21st century. The theological core of Pentecostalism is the conviction that the gifts of the Holy Spirit described in the New Testament, glossolalia, or speaking in tongues, divine healing, prophecy, and the discernment of spirits, are not historical phenomena confined to the apostolic era of the early church but living realities available to every believer in every generation, and that the authentic Christian life is marked not primarily by doctrinal correctness or moral rectitude, but by the direct, experiential encounter with the power of the Spirit, whose manifestations are both personally transformative and publicly visible. The extraordinary appeal of this theology, particularly in the communities of the Global South, among the urban poor of Latin America, the rural poor of sub-Saharan Africa, and the rapidly urbanizing populations of Southeast Asia, who have embraced Pentecostalism in numbers that have transformed the religious map of those regions within a single generation, lies in its particular combination of the direct experience of divine presence, the practical theology of healing and material blessing that speaks to the most urgent concerns of communities living with poverty, illness, and social marginalization, and the strong communal bonds of the congregation that provide, in the atomized environment of the rapidly modernizing city, the social support networks that traditional community structures no longer supply. Pentecostalism is now the defining face of world Christianity, not the cathedral but the tent, not the inherited institution but the gathered community of those who have felt, in their own bodies and their own lives, the touch of the Spirit they proclaim. Fact 82: Religion and Suffering, the problem that never goes away. The problem of suffering, the particular philosophical and theological challenge posed by the existence of pain, illness, loss, injustice, and death in a world, understood to be the creation of a God who is both omnipotent and good, the question known in philosophical theology as theodicy, from the Greek words for God and justice, is the oldest and the most persistently difficult challenge in the entire history of religious thought, and the one whose urgency is least diminished by the passage of time or the accumulation of theological argument, because the suffering it seeks to explain is not an abstract philosophical datum, but the lived experience of every human being who has ever watched a child die, or lived through the aftermath of a catastrophe, or simply lain awake at 3 a.m. under the weight of a grief that no argument can reach. The Book of Job, the extraordinary Hebrew text whose composition is dated by scholars to somewhere between the 7th and the 4th century BCE, and whose narrative, the story of a righteous man whose God allows his life to be destroyed in a cosmic wager with the adversary, strips away one by one the conventional theological explanations of suffering and finds each of them insufficient, is the most honest and the most formally daring engagement with the problem of theodicy in any religious literature. Its particular refusal of easy resolution, reflected in the divine speech from the whirlwind that concludes the poetic dialogue, not with an explanation of Job's suffering, but with a series of unanswerable questions about the vastness of the cosmos and the limits of human understanding, a response that satisfies no philosophical demand, but that many readers have found, paradoxically, more adequate to the experience of suffering than any theological argument. The Buddhist approach to suffering, the first noble truth is simply that suffering is the universal condition of unawakened existence, and the subsequent truths identify its cause and its cessation without reference to divine will or cosmic justice, sidesteps the theodicy problem by declining to posit a creator God whose goodness must be reconciled with the existence of pain, replacing the question of why suffering exists with the practical question of how it can be ended. Fact 83: The monastery, sacred community apart from the world. The monastery, the institution in which a community of men or women withdraws from ordinary social life to pursue the religious life in a structured environment of prayer, labor, scholarship, and mutual accountability, regulated by a common rule whose detailed prescription of the hours of prayer, the organization of work, and the governance of the community creates a total way of life organized entirely around the encounter with the sacred, is among the most consequential and most distinctive institutions in the history of religion, present in the Buddhist, Christian, Jain, and Hindu traditions, in forms whose external differences conceal a remarkable convergence in their understanding of what the withdrawal from ordinary life is for and what the community of the withdrawn can offer to the world it has left behind. The Buddhist monastery, the vihara, established in the earliest centuries of the Buddhist tradition as the settled community in which the wandering monks could gather during the monsoon season, and which gradually developed into the permanent institution of the Sangha, the community of ordained monks and nuns that constitutes one of the 3 jewels of Buddhist practice alongside the Buddha and the Dharma, has been the primary vehicle of Buddhist scholarship, meditation practice, and missionary activity across the entire history of the tradition. The great monastic universities of ancient India, Nalanda and Vikramashila, serving as the intellectual centers from which Buddhist learning was transmitted to Tibet, China, Korea, and Japan. The Christian monastery in its Benedictine form, shaped by the rule written by Benedict of Nursia in approximately 530 CE for his community at Monte Cassino, whose prescription of the Opus Dei, the work of God, the 8 daily prayer offices that structure the monastic day around the continuous offering of praise, became the primary institution of Western Christian civilization through the early medieval period. Its scriptoria preserving the intellectual heritage of classical antiquity, its agricultural innovations transforming the landscape of medieval Europe, and its network of hospitality, providing the infrastructure of travel and care for the sick across a continent in which no other such network existed. Fact 84. The theology of hope. What religions promise about the future. Every major religious tradition makes claims about the future, not merely the future of individual souls after death, whose different visions occupy Fact 56, but the future of the cosmos itself, the ultimate direction and destination of the entire historical process, whose unfolding constitutes the shared experience of humanity. These eschatological visions, from the Greek word for last things, are among the most consequential theological commitments of each tradition, because the understanding of where history is going shapes, in ways both obvious and subtle, the understanding of what is worth doing within it, what can be hoped for, what must be resisted, and what in the end will prove to have mattered. The Jewish messianic hope, the expectation of a future age in which the brokenness of the present order will be healed, in which justice will be established on the earth, in which the knowledge of God will cover the earth as the waters cover the sea, and in which the ingathering of the exiles and the restoration of Israel will signal the dawn of a transformed world, has been the most politically activating eschatological vision in Western religious history. Its particular insistence that the redemption hoped for is a this worldly transformation rather than an escape from the world, making it the theological ancestor of every revolutionary social vision that has drawn on religious categories to motivate the struggle for justice. The Christian eschatology of the kingdom of God, whose coming Jesus proclaimed as the central theme of his teaching, whose nature has been debated by theologians from Origen to Augustine to Karl Barth, and whose relationship to historical political action has generated the full spectrum of Christian political theology, from the Quietism of the Anabaptists to the revolutionary activism of liberation theology, shares the Jewish commitment to the transformation of the historical order, while adding the conviction that the crucifixion and resurrection of Christ constitute the decisive event in which that transformation has already, in some sense, begun. The Buddhist understanding of the end of the current cosmic cycle and the eventual appearance of the future Buddha Maitreya, the compassionate teacher who will arise when the Dharma has entirely faded from the world, offers a vision of cosmic renewal whose particular gentleness, the future brought by compassion rather than by judgment, reflects the Buddhist tradition's distinctive moral sensibility. Fact 85. The saints, holy figures across traditions. The saint, the figure within a religious tradition who is understood to have achieved an exceptional degree of closeness to the divine, whether through martyrdom, ascetic practice, mystical experience, or the consistent performance of the moral demands of the tradition, at a level that ordinary human beings recognize as beyond their ordinary reach, and whose particular holiness is understood to continue to exert a beneficial influence on the living community after their death. Making them accessible as intercessors, models, and sources of spiritual power is present in some form in virtually every major religious tradition, and the veneration of such figures is among the most widespread and the most emotionally intense practices in the global history of religion. The Catholic tradition of saints, whose formal canonization process, developed in the medieval period and refined into its current form by the modern papacy, requires the verification of miracles attributed to the candidate's intercession and a rigorous historical investigation of the life and writings, creating an official list of more than 10,000 named saints whose feast days structure the liturgical calendar. Is the most institutionally elaborate expression of the universal religious intuition that certain human lives are lived in so close a proximity to the sacred that they continue to radiate its presence after their earthly conclusion. The Sufi tradition of the Awliya Allah, the Friends of God, the holy figures whose shrines across the Islamic world from Morocco to Indonesia attract millions of pilgrims each year who come to seek their barakah, their spiritual blessing, has been the primary vehicle of popular Islamic devotion across the medieval and early modern periods, and the primary target of the Wahhabi and Salafi reform movements, whose destruction of these shrines represents the most consequential single act of religious iconoclasm in the contemporary Islamic world. The Bodhisattva ideal of Mahayana Buddhism, in which the being who has attained the capacity for enlightenment chooses to remain in the cycle of rebirth, delaying their own final liberation until all sentient beings have been freed from suffering, is the most ambitious formulation in any tradition of the conviction that holiness is not a private achievement, but a gift offered back to the world. Fact 86. Religion in China, ancient faiths under the modern state. The religious history of China, the civilization whose particular combination of Confucianism, Taoism, Buddhism, and the vast complex of popular religious practice that scholars call Chinese folk religion, has produced the most syncretically varied religious culture of any major civilization. a culture in which the sharp boundaries between traditions that characterize the Abrahamic world have historically been absent, and in which it has been entirely normal for a Chinese family to consult a Taoist priest for a funeral, a Buddhist monk for a period of mourning, and a Confucian scholar for the education of children, understanding these as complementary resources rather than mutually exclusive commitments, entered its most consequential modern crisis with the establishment of the People's Republic of China under Mao Zedong in 1949, whose Marxist ideology categorized religion as superstition, the opium of the people, and whose Cultural Revolution of 1966 to 1976 launched the most systematic attempt to destroy religious life and religious culture that any state had undertaken in the 20th century, closing and destroying temples, monasteries, and churches, forcing religious personnel to renounce their vows, and attempting to replace the religious worldview with the cult of Mao himself, a cult whose particular forms the Little Red Book venerated as sacred text. The public confession and self-criticism as ritual practice, the mass rallies as communal worship, revealed in their borrowed religious vocabulary the impossibility of eliminating the religious impulse simply by suppressing its traditional forms. The partial relaxation of religious restrictions after Mao's death in 1976 has produced a remarkable religious revival across China, with estimates of the number of practicing Christians in China ranging from 60 to 100 million, the number of Buddhist practitioners in the hundreds of millions, and the Taoist and folk religious traditions continuing to flourish in the space between official tolerance and official suspicion that characterizes the contemporary Chinese state's management of its vast and restless religious population. Fact 87. The meaning of prayer, speaking into the silence. Prayer, the practice of addressing speech, however it is understood, to the divine or to the sacred ground of reality, whether in the formal language of the liturgical tradition, the spontaneous language of personal petition and gratitude, the silent language of contemplative attention, or the bodily language of prostration and gesture, is the most universal practice in the history of religion and the one whose particular intimacy. The directness of the claim it makes upon the attention of the ultimate reality makes it the clearest expression of the fundamental religious conviction that the universe is not deaf to the human voice. The extraordinary range of forms that prayer has taken across the traditions, the elaborate liturgical poetry of the Jewish prayer book, the Siddur, whose texts have been prayed by Jewish communities across every continent for nearly 2,000 years, the 5 daily prayers of Islam, whose prescribed postures and whose Arabic words bind the Muslim worshipper to a global community, performing the same act at the same hours around the turning world. The contemplative silence of the Quaker meeting, in which the community gathers in wordless expectation of the direct movement of the Spirit, without the mediation of ordained clergy or prescribed liturgy. And the mantra recitation of the Hindu and Buddhist traditions, in which the repeated sacred syllable creates, over the course of sustained practice, a transformation of consciousness that the practitioner understands as the dissolution of the ordinary mind's boundaries into the awareness of the sacred reality that underlies it, reflects the different theologies of the divine-human relationship that each tradition embodies. What unites these forms across their differences is the fundamental act they all perform, the turning of the human attention, however partially and however inadequately, away from the self and its preoccupations, and toward whatever the tradition understands as the ultimate source and ground of the existence that the practitioner momentarily inhabits. Prayer is, in this sense, the most intimate act in the history of religion, and the most honest, because it is performed in the full awareness that the one addressed may not answer, and that the silence that follows may be the most important thing the prayer contains. Fact 88. Religious conversion, the moment faith changes. Religious conversion, the experience in which an individual moves from one religious identity to another, or from no religious identity to one, or from a nominal to a committed relationship with a religious tradition, through a process whose particular character ranges from the sudden and overwhelming Paul on the road to Damascus, struck blind by the light of the risen Christ, to the gradual and almost imperceptible, the slow deepening of a practice, the incremental shift of a worldview. The accumulating weight of a community's influence is among the most psychologically complex and the most socially consequential events in the history of religion, the primary engine by which religious traditions have grown and the primary mechanism by which the religious map of the world has been redrawn in every century. The psychology of conversion was first subjected to serious academic analysis by William James in his Varieties of Religious Experience, published in 1902, a work that remains, more than a century after its composition, the most influential single study of the phenomenon, its particular contribution the insistence that the conversion experience, however it is theologically interpreted, is a real psychological event whose particular characteristics. The sense of a divided self unified, the experience of a new reality breaking through the ordinary, the relief of what James called the sick soul finding its way to what he called the healthy-minded state, are observable and describable independently of the theological framework within which the convert understands them. The social consequences of conversion have been among the most consequential in human history. The conversion of Constantine to Christianity in the 4th century transformed the Roman Empire. The conversion of the Mongol Khans to Islam in the 13th century determined the religious character of Central Asia for the next 7 centuries. And the mass conversions of the colonial period, in the Americas, in sub-Saharan Africa, and in Asia, reshaped the religious landscape of 3 continents in ways whose effects continue to define the global distribution of religious identity in the present moment. Fact 89, the future of religion, what the 21st century is asking. The 21st century has posed to every major religious tradition a set of questions whose particular combination of urgency and novelty has no precedent in the history of religion. Questions about artificial intelligence and the nature of consciousness, about genetic engineering and the boundaries of the human, about ecological collapse and the obligations of the present generation to those who will inherit what remains of the natural world, about the digital transformation of community and its implications for the gathered, embodied forms of religious life, and about the radical pluralism of the contemporary world, whose particular combination of global communication and mass migration has made the encounter between different religious traditions not an occasional diplomatic event, but a daily lived reality for hundreds of millions of people. The question of artificial intelligence poses to religious anthropology, the understanding of what it means to be human, the most fundamental challenge since Darwin, because the development of systems that display the functional capacities of consciousness, creativity, and moral reasoning raises with renewed urgency the question of where, in the human being, the soul or the spirit or the consciousness resides that the religious traditions have understood as the ground of moral status and the seat of the divine image. The question of ecological collapse poses to every tradition that understands the natural world as the creation of a good God, the question of whether the present generation's treatment of that creation constitutes, in theological terms, a sin, and if so, what repentance requires. The question of digital community poses to traditions whose institutional life has been built around the gathered physical assembly. The church, the synagogue, the mosque, the temple, the question of whether the sacred can be adequately encountered in the disembodied space of the screen, whether the sacraments can be administered at a distance, whether the community that forms in the virtual space is the same kind of community as the one that has historically carried the tradition. These are not questions that the traditions can answer quickly, but they are questions that the traditions are, right now, beginning to ask. Fact 90, religion at 90. 90 facts into the history of religion, and we stand now at the edge of the present moment. Looking back across the vast landscape, we have traveled and forward into the 10 facts that remain, which belong not to the past, but to what the past has made possible and what the present is making necessary. We have followed the Pentecostal fire from a converted warehouse in Los Angeles to 600 million believers across the global south, and understood that the history of religion does not move only from the center to the margins, but from the margins back to the center, its energy renewed again and again in the places where human beings are most in need of what faith can offer. We have sat with the problem of suffering, the oldest and the hardest problem in the history of religious thought, and refused the easy answers without abandoning the question. We have walked the corridors of the monastery and understood that the withdrawal from the world is not the abandonment of the world, but a specific form of love for it, a commitment to maintaining in the midst of the noise, the silence in which the sacred can be heard. We have prayed in every language the traditions offer, in the formal poetry of the Siddur, in the Arabic prostration of the Salat, in the wordless waiting of the Quaker meeting, and recognized that all of these are attempts to perform the same impossible act, to speak into the silence and trust that the silence is listening. We have stood at the threshold of the questions that the 21st century is posing to the traditions, about consciousness, about the earth, about the nature of community in a digital age, and recognized that the history of religion is not finished but continuing, in this very moment, in ways whose outcome no one alive can predict. 10 facts remain, we are nearly home. Rest now in the deep quiet of what 90 facts have held. This is Explore During Sleeping. Fact 91, the role of religious leaders, prophets, priests, and sages. Every religious tradition has developed, over the course of its history, a set of figures whose particular role is to mediate between the community and the sacred. to perform the rituals that maintain the relationship between the human and the divine, to interpret the sacred texts whose meaning is not self-evident, to speak on behalf of the divine to the community, or to embody in their own person the qualities of holiness and wisdom that the tradition understands as the highest human possibility. The typology of religious leadership, the prophet, the priest, and the sage, was first systematized by the sociologist Max Weber in the early 20th century, and it remains one of the most useful frameworks for understanding the diversity of religious authority across traditions and historical periods. The prophet, the figure called by the divine to speak a word that the community does not want to hear, to challenge the existing order in the name of the values that the existing order is betraying, is the most disruptive form of religious leadership, the one whose authority derives not from institutional position, but from the direct claim of divine commission, and whose particular function in the history of religion has been to prevent the institution from becoming entirely self-serving. To recall the community to the values in whose name the institution was founded and from which it has drifted. The priest, the figure whose authority derives from institutional appointment, and whose function is the maintenance of the ritual order that sustains the community's relationship with the sacred across time, is the most conservative form of religious leadership, the one whose value lies precisely in the continuity it provides, the accumulated wisdom of the tradition, transmitted through the careful performance of forms whose meaning deepens with repetition. The sage, the figure whose authority derives from the depth of understanding, achieved through years of study, practice, and the kind of experience that no institution can confer, is the most personal form of religious leadership, the one whose influence operates through the quality of presence rather than the exercise of institutional power, and whose particular contribution to the traditions in which this figure appears is the demonstration that the encounter with the sacred is not merely institutional but personal, not merely inherited but achieved. Fact 92. Ritual, why the sacred must be repeated. Ritual, the structured, repeated, symbolic action whose performance marks the boundaries between the ordinary and the sacred, between one stage of life and another, between the community and the world outside it, and between the present moment and the sacred time of the tradition's founding events, is the most universal feature of religious life across all human cultures and all historical periods, more universal even than belief. Because there are religious traditions in which doctrinal formulation is relatively undeveloped, while ritual practice is extraordinarily elaborate, but there are no religious traditions of which we have any knowledge in which ritual is absent. The universality of ritual across human cultures has prompted researchers in evolutionary psychology, cognitive science, and anthropology to ask what function it serves that is deep enough and important enough to have generated its presence in every known human society. And the answers that the research has produced are varied and mutually reinforcing. Ritual creates and maintains group cohesion. The synchronized performance of the same actions by a community simultaneously generates a sense of shared identity and shared commitment that spontaneous social interaction cannot reliably produce. Ritual manages anxiety. The performance of a prescribed sequence of actions in the face of an uncertain or threatening situation provides the practitioner with a sense of agency and control whose psychological benefit is measurable, even when the ritual has no causal effect on the outcome it addresses. Ritual marks time. The religious calendar, whose festivals and fasts structure the year around the recurring commemoration of the tradition's founding events, creates the experience of sacred time, the sense that the present moment is connected to a past whose significance does not diminish with repetition, but deepens with it. The particular genius of the great ritual traditions, the Passover Seder, the Catholic Mass, the Buddhist Puja, the Islamic Salat, is their combination of these functions in a single sustained act that is simultaneously theatrical and intimate, communal and personal, historically rooted and immediately present. An act that asks nothing of the practitioner beyond their attention and their willingness to be present, and that gives back in that attention and that presence. A form of meaning that no merely cognitive act can produce. Fact 93. Religious syncretism, when traditions meet and mix. Religious syncretism, the process by which elements of different religious traditions are combined, blended, or mutually incorporated, producing new religious forms whose particular character reflects the encounter between the original traditions in the specific historical and cultural context in which that encounter occurred, is among the most creative and the most contested processes in the entire history of religion. Celebrated by those who understand it as evidence of the adaptability and the universal resonance of the religious impulse, and condemned by those who understand it as the dilution or corruption of the pure tradition, whose integrity is the source of its authority. The history of religion is, in a very substantial sense, a history of syncretism, because no major religious tradition has developed in isolation from other traditions, and the encounter between traditions has been the primary engine of theological creativity in every period of religious history. Buddhism absorbed and transformed the Brahmanic ritual and philosophical categories of ancient India in its own formation, incorporated the local deity traditions of every Asian culture it encountered in its expansion, and produced in Zen the particular synthesis of Buddhist philosophy and Taoist aesthetics that is among the most distinctive and most influential religious forms ever created. Christianity absorbed the Platonic philosophy of late antiquity into its theological tradition through the work of the Alexandrian theologians, adopted the religious calendar of the Roman Empire and overlaid it with Christian commemorations, and incorporated the local religious customs of every European and non-European people. It evangelized into forms whose Christian surface covers strata of pre-Christian religious sensibility that continue to shape the character of Christian practice in different cultures to this day. The Santeria of Cuba, the Candomblé of Brazil, and the Vodou of Haiti, the Afro-American religious traditions whose formation in the conditions of slavery combined the Yoruba and Fon religious traditions of West Africa with the Catholic Christianity of the colonial masters in ways that preserved the African religious core beneath a Catholic exterior, are the most dramatic examples of syncretism as survival of the religious imagination finding. In the materials available within the conditions of oppression, the forms through which the sacred can continue to be encountered and the community can continue to be sustained. Fact 94, the neuroscience of religious experience, what the brain reveals. The scientific study of religious experience, the particular research program that has developed since the 1970s at the intersection of neuroscience, psychology, and the academic study of religion, seeking to understand what happens in the brain and the body during the states of consciousness that practitioners of contemplative traditions describe as mystical experience, and what the findings of that research imply about the nature of the experiences being studied, is among the most consequential and the most philosophically complex areas in the contemporary relationship between science and religion. Its particular findings, neither as hostile to religious interpretation, as the critics of religion have hoped, nor as supportive of it, as the defenders of religion have claimed. The foundational studies of the neuroscience of meditation, beginning with the research of Herbert Benson in the 1970s on the relaxation response induced by transcendental meditation, continuing through the work of Andrew Newberg and colleagues on the neural correlates of mystical states in Franciscan nuns and Tibetan Buddhist meditators, and including the more recent work of Richard Davidson and colleagues at the University of Wisconsin on the measurable neuroplasticity induced by long-term meditation practice, have established beyond reasonable scientific doubt that the practices of the contemplative traditions produce real and measurable changes in the brain, in the body's stress response systems, and in the psychological dispositions of those who practice them, changes whose direction toward greater emotional regulation, greater compassion, greater attentional stability, and greater well-being aligns with the goals that the traditions themselves set for their practitioners. What these findings cannot resolve, and what they were never designed to resolve, is the metaphysical question of whether the neural correlates of mystical experience are the cause of that experience, in which case the experience is nothing more than its neural substrate, or whether they are merely the mechanism through which a reality that transcends the neural is encountered, in which case the brain is not the source of the experience, but the instrument through which it is received. This question is not a scientific question, it is a philosophical one, and it remains, as it has always been, open. Fact 95, what religions share, the common grammar of the sacred. Beneath the extraordinary diversity of the world's religious traditions, the diversity of their theologies and their cosmologies, their ritual forms and their moral codes, their sacred texts and their institutional structures, their understandings of God and the self and the relationship between them, there lies a set of features so widely shared, so consistently present across traditions as different as Amazonian shamanism and Calvinist Christianity, Theravada Buddhism and Shinto, that their universality has led researchers in the comparative study of religion to ask whether they reflect something structural about the human religious impulse itself, something built into the architecture of the consciousness that generates religious experience in whatever cultural form it finds available. The most widely shared of these features include the distinction between the sacred and the profane, the recognition, present in virtually every religious tradition, that not all of reality is encountered with the same quality of attention, that certain places, times, objects, and persons are marked by a quality of presence that the ordinary world lacks, and that demands a different mode of engagement. The conviction that reality extends beyond what the ordinary senses perceive, that the visible world is embedded in or sustained by an invisible world whose nature and whose moral demands are the central concern of religion. The understanding that human beings are somehow out of alignment with the deepest truth of their situation, and that religion offers the path of return, whether through repentance, enlightenment, ritual purification, or the gift of grace. And the importance of community, the understanding that the religious life is not a solitary achievement, but a communal practice, that the tradition is transmitted through the community, and that the community is sustained by the tradition in a relationship whose health is the condition of both. These commonalities do not dissolve the real and significant differences between traditions. But they suggest that the questions religion addresses are not culturally contingent, but arise from the conditions of conscious existence itself, and that the human being who asks them is doing something whose importance is not diminished by the diversity of the answers that have been given. Fact 96. Religion and silence, the sacred in the space between words. In the history of religion, silence occupies a place whose importance is inversely proportional to the attention it receives, precisely because it leaves no record, generates no text, and produces no institutional structure, and yet has been understood by the deepest practitioners of virtually every contemplative tradition as the most immediate access point to the sacred reality that all the words and rituals and doctrines of religion are attempting, from a greater distance, to approach. The apophatic tradition in theology, the via negativa, the negative way, which approaches the divine not by saying what God is, but by systematically negating every finite description that the human mind applies to the infinite, recognizing that every positive predicate drawn from human experience, powerful, good, wise, loving, is when applied to the ultimate reality, simultaneously true in some analogical sense and inadequate in every literal sense, is the intellectual expression of the insight that silence is not merely the absence of speech about the divine, but the most honest available response to the divine's excess over every human category. Meister Eckhart, the 14th century Dominican mystic, whose sermons pushed the language of Christian mysticism to the edge of what the institution could accommodate, spoke of the Godhead behind God, the silent ground of the divine being that precedes every name and every attribute, into which the soul that has emptied itself of every finite attachment finally sinks in the experience that Eckhart called the breakthrough. The Quaker tradition, whose gathered meeting in silent expectation, without liturgy or sermon or ordained minister, is the most radical institutional expression in Protestant Christianity of the conviction that the divine speaks directly to the prepared heart without the mediation of any human structure, has produced, in its 4 centuries of practice, a community whose particular combination of contemplative depth and social activism embodies the insight that the silence in which God is encountered is not a withdrawal from the world, but the source of the energy and the clarity with which the world's injustices can be faced. Fact 97. The children of Abraham, one family, 3 faiths. The relationship between Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, the 3 traditions that trace their spiritual lineage to the figure of Abraham, the patriarch of Genesis, whose radical act of faith in leaving his homeland, in obedience to a divine call, whose destination he did not know, established the paradigm of the religious life, as the willingness to venture into the unknown on the authority of a divine promise, is the most consequential interfamilial relationship in the history of religion. Its particular combination of shared origin and profound theological disagreement, of mutual indebtedness and centuries of violent conflict, defining the religious landscape of the Western world and the Middle East for the past 2,000 years, and generating the questions that are most urgently present in the global political crisis of the contemporary moment. The shared inheritance is vast. The same God, described in many of the same terms, creator of heaven and earth, just and merciful, the one who acts in history, the one who demands righteousness and promises redemption. The same founding figure in Abraham, whose different roles in the 3 traditions, the father of Isaac through whom the covenant with Israel is transmitted in Judaism, the spiritual ancestor of all believers in Paul's reading in Christianity, and the first Muslim in the Islamic understanding of his total submission to the divine will, reveal how the same story can be the common property of traditions whose theological conclusions diverge fundamentally. And the same prophetic tradition whose moral demands, care for the poor, justice for the widow and the orphan, the priority of inner righteousness over external observance, recur with remarkable consistency across the 3 traditions' scriptures. The history of the relationship between these 3 traditions is not only a history of conflict, it is also a history of extraordinary intellectual cross-fertilization. The Jewish philosophers of medieval Andalusia, shaped by Islamic philosophy, the Christian scholastics of the 13th century reading Aristotle through the commentaries of the Muslim Ibn Rushd and the Jew Maimonides. The three traditions circling one another in a conversation whose full depth has rarely been recognized by those conducting it. Fact 98. Religion and love, the heart of every tradition. If there is a single concept that appears at the center of more religious traditions than any other, more consistently, more emphatically, and with more practical consequence for the shape of the religious life, it is love. The particular orientation of the self toward the other, toward the divine, toward the stranger, the enemy, and the suffering, that the major traditions have in different ways, and with different emphases identified as the highest human capacity and the closest approximation available to mortal beings of the divine character itself. The Hebrew Bible's command to love the Lord your God with all your heart, and with all your soul, and with all your might, and to love your neighbor as yourself, the two commandments that Jesus identified as the summary of the entire Torah, places love not at the periphery of the religious demand, but at its center, making it not one obligation among many, but the encompassing frame within which all specific obligations find their meaning. The Buddhist concept of metta, loving kindness, the cultivated disposition of unconditional goodwill toward all sentient beings without exception, extended through the practice of meditation outward from the self to the loved ones, the neutral persons, the difficult persons, and finally to all beings without distinction, is one of the four Brahma-viharas, the divine abodes. The qualities of mind, whose cultivation is understood as the most direct approximation of the enlightened mind available to the unawakened practitioner. The Sufi tradition's understanding of divine love, the ishq, the burning and consuming love of God that the great Sufi poets describe with the imagery of the lover consumed by longing for the beloved, places the experience of love at the absolute center of the religious life, understanding it not as a sentiment, but as a transformative ontological reality, a fire that burns away the false self and leaves in its place the transparency through which the divine light can finally pass unobstructed. What these traditions share is not a sentiment, but a conviction that the movement toward the other, toward God, toward the neighbor, toward the stranger, is not a diminishment of the self, but its fullest possible realization, and that the universe, whatever else it may be, is the kind of place in which love is not wasted. Fact 99. What religion has been, a reckoning. We stand now at the 99th fact, one step from the end, and it is time for the kind of reckoning that the full sweep of the history we have traveled demands. Religion has been, across the 5,000 years and the 100 traditions, and the hundreds of millions of individual lives that this history encompasses, the most consequential force in the human story, the force that has built the greatest architecture, generated the greatest art, sustained the most vulnerable, and articulated the highest visions of what human life can be. It has also sanctioned the most destructive wars, justified the most systematic oppressions, silenced the most important voices, and performed the most elaborate intellectual contortions in the service of the most powerful interests. Both of these things are true, and neither cancels the other, and any account of the history of religion that resolves the tension between them by emphasizing only one side is not telling the truth. Religion has been the primary language in which human beings have expressed their conviction that existence is not meaningless, that the fact that there is something rather than nothing is not an accident to be shrugged at, but a mystery to be inhabited, that the hunger for justice is not a biochemical quirk, but a response to something real. That the love that makes ordinary human life bearable is not an illusion generated by evolution for reproductive advantage, but a participation in a reality whose depth the evolutionary account does not begin to exhaust. It has also been the primary institutional vehicle through which the fear of death, the hunger for certainty, and the desire for power have been organized into systems of control whose particular genius is the capacity to convince those being controlled that their submission is sacred. The human being who approaches the history of religion with the full complexity it deserves will not emerge from the encounter as either a believer or an atheist, at least, not in any simple sense. They will emerge as someone who has sat with the full weight of what their species has done in the name of the sacred, and who understands that the questions religion addresses are not going away, and that the quality of the answers humanity gives to them will shape everything that comes next. Fact 100, the history of religion, what it asks of us. And so we arrive at the 100th fact, at the end of a journey that began in the darkness of the prehistoric cave, where the first human hands pressed against stone and left their mark in pigment, and that has traveled through 5,000 years of temples and scriptures, prophets and martyrs, cathedrals and monasteries and mosques and meditation halls, through the greatest compassion the human species has produced, and through some of its most terrible violence, to arrive here. In this quiet moment, in the dark, religion has asked, in every language, in every century, in every landscape it has inhabited, the same questions, not the same answers, not the same rituals, not the same theologies, but the same questions. Why is there something rather than nothing? What does the existence of the world ask of us? How should we live, and with whom, and in service of what? What remains of a person after they are gone? What does love require? These are not religious questions in any narrow sense. They are human questions, the questions that arise wherever conscious beings live long enough in community to discover that the practical business of survival does not exhaust the meaning of a human life. The history of religion is the record of the human attempt to answer those questions, an attempt that has produced, across its 5,000-year span, achievements of such extraordinary beauty and depth that their loss would impoverish the human spirit beyond calculation, and failures of such gravity that their honest acknowledgement is the condition of any serious claim to moral authority. It is a history that contains the Sermon on the Mount and the Crusades, the Upanishads and the Inquisition, the compassion of Kuan Yin and the violence of religious nationalism, the mystical union sought in the monastery and the terror imposed by the theocratic state, all of it human, all of it reaching in its own way and with its own tools, towards something that the reaching itself suggests is real. What the history of religion asks of us in the end is not belief or disbelief but attention, the willingness to look honestly at what human beings have done when they have organized their lives around the conviction that the universe is not indifferent to them, and to bring to that looking the same quality of seriousness that the traditions themselves, at their best, have brought to the questions they exist to address. Cave paintings at Lascaux are 35,000 years old. The hands that made them are gone, but the impulse that moved those hands, the impulse to mark the world, to say something was here, to reach toward whatever it is that the darkness contains, is the same impulse that built Chartres Cathedral and carved the Buddha at Bodh Gaya, and lifted the call to prayer from 10,000 minarets across the turning world. It is perhaps the most distinctively human impulse there is, and it has not finished yet. Close your eyes, let the long story of what human beings have believed and feared and loved and built in the name of the sacred settle into the quiet around you. You have traveled 5,000 years tonight, through temples and deserts, through the silence of the monastery and the fire of the revival tent, through the darkness of history's worst hours and the light of its most luminous visions. Carry what you have heard gently. The questions are yours now. The story continues in you. This is Explore During Sleeping,